Prologue. Beacon Hills, 1998. Randy Noland wasn't supposed to be out this late. His parents had been fast asleep when he'd snuck out. They were the least of his worries. Last thing he wanted was a bored deputy with nothing but time on their hands to bring him home. Not when he was this close to the truth. He didn't care about being out after curfew or his parents grounding him for the rest of the year, because he'd finally figured out what caused his brother's death. Or at least he thought he had. He'd painstakingly put together everything he and his friends had done, leading up to that last week. The week before, 2 of his brother's best friends had disappeared, and his brother had drowned. All the things that his parents didn't want to think about, things that they and the rest of the town were more than happy to leave in the past. Like everyone else, his parents were happy to believe that his brother's death and the disappearances of his friends were simply a series of tragic coincidences. But the fact was, his brother Paul was gone, and he was never coming back. And neither were any of the other missing kids. Which is why no one was searching for them. The adults knew, deep down, they remembered why you never went into the swamp. Never called her name. They knew, just like he did, that she'd come for them. At the edge of the swamp, Randy flicked his flashlight on and looked out over the dark, muddy terrain. The peepers and bullfrogs didn't make a sound. An odd occurrence on a lazy summer night. Randy shivered as he felt the sudden chill in the air. A noticeable change from the constant summer humidity. It felt the same way as it had the night when Paul went missing. Like Randy, Paul had made the trip out to the swamp all by himself. He'd caught his brother that night sneaking out of the house the same way he had tonight, he thought with a small twinge of guilt. Caught him with a backpack and a flashlight. Paul had told him everything was going to be all right. That he was going to fix everything, so it would all go back to normal. He'd lied. Paul's plan had failed, but Randy's wouldn't. That he was sure of. To avenge his brother, he'd stop her once and for all. As he walked through the mud and the muck, he looked for the trail that would lead him up to the old house. He didn't go near the water. He didn't dare. She was out there. He could feel it, like the surrounding swamp was watching him. Waiting for him to make the mistake that would cost him his life, but he knew the rules. She was waiting for him, and she could keep waiting, because he would not make it easy on her. He wouldn't call her name, he wouldn't even think it. He found the trail easily enough. His heart thudded in his chest as he moved up the trail. When he heard a stick snap off to the left, he didn't dare turn his head. She might be wandering around, watching him, waiting for him to get close, but she wouldn't try to stop him. Not yet. She couldn't. At least that's what his brother's journal made it seem like. His brother's journal had clarified that she preferred it when the children came to her. He'd found that out. Oh yes, he knew from talking to Mr. Crancher that she had a specific set of rules she had to follow before she could come after those she deemed hers. Paul had kept a somewhat detailed journal about what he'd learned by watching his friends end up dead or go missing one by one. Then he tracked down older deaths and disappearances from as far back as he could. When he wasn't partying, Paul had always been smart. Smarter than their parents or his teachers had given him credit for. Randy supposed if his brother had been really smart, though, he never would have set foot in this swamp. His brother had worked hard trying to discover the source of the evil that plagued Beacon Swamp, all while being hunted by the same entity. He just didn't have the time to finish the job. Randy knew what his parents didn't. His brother's death wasn't an accident. Paul had been swimming since before Randy was born. He loved the water. There was no way he'd accidentally drowned himself down in the swamp. Somewhere deep down, his parents had to know that. They probably just didn't want to think about it either. Like Paul had written repeatedly in his journal, they just wanted it to all be over. And he knew that the sheriff and his deputies, no matter how many members of the state police they called in, would never find out what happened to his brother. They couldn't. Mrs. Hernshaw didn't go for adults. It wasn't part of the rules. He knew Paul had come out here. He wondered if, when walking through the low-hanging cypress trees and wiping spider webs off his face, if his brother had been afraid. Paul was 2 years older and played on the football team. Their dad had always said that Paul was tough as nails. Randy, though, was scared. more scared than he'd ever been in his entire life. Scared because he knew once he saw the house, once he called her name, that he wouldn't have much time to finish what his brother started. He'd known the day Paul went missing what had happened. His boots were gone, and more importantly, so was the gas can they used for their mini bike. His brother had warned him to stay away from the swamp, warned him that if he went missing not to look for him. He told everyone that, right up until they found his body floating face down. After they found Davy drowned in his bathroom sink, Paul changed completely. He became more secretive and paranoid, to where he even began sleeping with the lights on. And if the smell was anything to go on, Randy doubted his brother had showered for days. His parents thought that after losing so many of his friends over the summer that Paul was depressed, so before his disappearance, they'd been talking about sending him to talk to someone, a professional. Paul swore to Randy that something was after him, something from the swamp. An old evil that wouldn't stop until it claimed him too. But he was going to stop it, his brother had promised. He was going to be the hero that he knew he could be, by vanquishing this evil before it took any more innocent lives. Just like the role-playing games he played with his friends. Sometimes the heroes didn't always make it though, Randy thought, an ache in his heart as he did so. Following the clearing, he found the path leading up to the house. It wasn't much, just a small and somewhat dry path that led through the trees and up to the house. When Randy reached the house, he knew he was in trouble. Not the kind he could get himself out of either. This was it. No matter what happened next, he knew that there was a chance he wasn't going home. A loose tear broke free and slid down his cheek. He wiped it away and steeled himself for what he knew he had to do. He knew what had to happen next, for his brother who was gone, and his sister who was too young to realize what he was doing and why. Randy needed to finish this before anyone else got hurt. If anyone was going to have a chance in this town, he needed to stop the evil that plagued this place once and for all. Because if he didn't, then all would have died for nothing. Randy sniffled. He didn't want to die. But like his brother Paul had always said when he'd been alive, wish in one hand, shit in the other, see which one fills up faster. Thinking of Paul helped him feel more sure of himself. His older brother always knew what needed to be done before he did. He'd always been confident. Randy pulled from Paul's memory just a little, as he shifted his backpack so that he could unzip it. Pulling out the little gas canister he'd stolen from the Robinsons' shed, he cradled it in his hands as he marched up to the house, feeling that eyes were on him the whole time. The fuel was his safety blanket. He knew that with it, he could finish his mission. When he and Paul had played soldiers when they were younger, Randy had always won. Mostly because he'd always had what his dad called conviction. That's what he had now. Randy felt it in himself as he went through the small thicket, and his stomach started doing flips. The house reminded him of an old dead skull, with its broken glass and open doors leering down on him. It was worse than anything that his imagination could have conjured. The front door was wide open as if beckoning him to come inside. The place looked like the swamp had tried to reclaim it at some point, but then decided against it at the last minute. Seemed like nature had chewed the whole place up and spit it back out. He was fishing for his lighter when he heard someone singing from inside the house. The music was beautiful, like a lullaby meant for children. He looked up and there was now a soft glow inside the house, as if the lights were on. Randy put the gas canister down and started fumbling harder for the lighter he'd stuffed in his jeans pocket. Something he'd taken from his mother's purse on the way out of the house. That was something at least he didn't even feel bad about. They were always trying to get her to quit. The lullaby sounded nice, then he heard it. Something that made his hand stop searching for just a minute. "Randy," Paul's voice shouted from inside the house. "Paul?" Randy shouted back excitedly. His brother was alive, after all. Even though some part of his brain knew that was wrong. He'd seen the body at the funeral home. "Everything going to be okay, Randy, just come inside," Paul's voice said from inside the house, where someone was still singing. Randy put the gasoline back into his backpack and zipped it back up. Then he walked inside. As soon as he walked past the threshold of the front door, it seemed like the summer heat fell away and was replaced with an icy chill that creeped up his spine. The singing also stopped, and a grim silence that seemed to haunt his every footstep. "Paul?" Randy called out, his voice echoing off the rotted boards of the house. "I'm down here," Paul called back. Following his voice, Randy found a door deeper in the house, one that led to the basement. He took out his flashlight and peered down the steps looking for his brother, but all he could see was the dark water in the flooded basement. "Paul, where are you?" Randy called for his brother. "Come down the stairs, Randy," Paul called out, but Randy couldn't see him. He walked down the stairs to the edge of the water. The stairs were rotten and creaked dangerously with each step. Randy was terrified, but he desperately wanted to find his brother. If he was really alive, he would be the hero, and his parents would be happy. Things would get back to normal. At the bottom of the stairs, he shined his light around. In the room's corner, he could see something floating on top of the water, so he shined his light on it. It was Paul. Just floating there, Randy knew, because he was still wearing his favorite Beavis and Butthead shirt. But something was wrong. Paul didn't react to the light, and he was floating face down. "Paul?" Randy asked, stepping into the water. His question was met by silence. Not even the house so much as creaked. "You're her," he said as tears tugged at the corners of his eyes. "Hernshaw." Barely a whisper, but apparently enough for the figure in the corner to sink down into the water before he could even contemplate what he'd just done. He took one more tentative step into the dark water, when a pair of hands suddenly locked around his ankles and pulled Randy into the water. He struggled, but no matter how hard he kicked and swam, he wasn't able to make it back to the surface. Before long, he stopped kicking altogether. 1. Chris could feel the sweat pouring off him in the stifling summer heat. His sister Misty and their friends Mike and Travis were all hanging out on Travis's front porch. The only thing worse than the humidity was their constant boredom, something that seemed to have gotten progressively worse the older they got. It was the type of listless boredom you got from being a teenager in a small town. The type that never seemed to go away. In a town whose newspapers seemed to only cover bake sales and obituaries full of old people who'd never left. Mingled with coverage of the local middle and high school sports teams just to keep it interesting, which only fed into school rivalries that had existed long before they'd even been born. A place where nothing newsworthy ever happened. The town wasn't even big enough to have a fair over the summer, and the river was a town over. All they had was a large stagnant swamp that attracted the occasional environmental researcher. Which left them nothing to do but sit on a front porch. Bored and hot, but at least they were outside. Not because they wanted to be, but because the porch was cooler than the inside of the house right now. Perhaps it was because outside they could at least feel the occasional breeze. Inside, all they got to was the chance to listen to a slowly dying air conditioner. The right turn that led into Beacon Hills was near the junkyard, where Old Man Watts left a stack of dead air conditioners stacked out front until fall. A comical tribute to all the ones that didn't survive the summer strain. Misty's father called them fallen soldiers and did a mock salute anytime they rode by. All around them throughout the neighborhood, there was the rattle of air conditioners wheezing and coughing as they struggled to keep up with the oppressive heat. Many of them were probably ready to give up. By the end of the summer, the scrapyard at the edge of town would have stacks of window units in front of it. Usually there was 2 stacks before September this year, with the heat she was betting on 3. A testament to the current heat wave they found themselves in. Stirring groggily, Mike reached into the cooler, handed Misty another can of cheerwine. She sighed as the cold can hit her hand and instead of drinking it, pressed it against her forehead. The old battered green and white fishing cooler was something they'd saved from the dump during one of their middle school escapades. Once the last of the ice melted, they would end up playing nose goes on who had to fill it up again. A game which Mike usually lost, which was why he was handing out drinks. The ice in the cooler had completely melted over an hour ago, and he didn't want to run home and get more. With a hiss, Misty popped the top on the can. The cool flavor of the syrupy cherry soda helped her to stay cool on days like this, and beat drinking the murky water that came up through the pipes. Sometimes they even talked when they could find something to talk about. But truth be told, there wasn't much going on in Beacon Hills. There wasn't even anything good to gossip about. Good gossip was hard to have when the entire school is less than 60 kids, and no one does anything because they've all known each other their entire lives. Hard to have much of anything really, Misty mused, looking over at Travis. He glanced down and laughed a little too loudly at something that her brother Chris had said, blushing slightly when their eyes met. We need to find something to do. Isn't there anything going on? Mike whined for what felt like the 100th time. She couldn't think of a time when Mike wasn't whining about one thing or another. But this time at least, she agreed with him. They couldn't just sit on this porch all summer. Not again, Misty thought miserably. Is there ever anything going on in Beacon Hills? Misty replied, pulling knots out of her long dark hair and trying not to snap at him. In this weather, it was hard to do. They were all already sweating through their clothes, and it wasn't even 2 o'clock yet. The heat made everyone's tempers a little too short. You've got that right, Chris mused. Watching paint dry is more interesting than this damn town. Travis spoke up. We could always go out into Beacon Swamp, he said, only half joking. And what, catch bullfrogs? Come on, we aren't kids anymore, Chris replied, not moving from where he lay sprawled out across the porch. Travis shook his head. No, not to catch frogs. We could go find the Hernshaw house and see if we can't wake her up. Mike took a sip of his drink, sighing because his can was almost empty and he wanted to savor the last drop. Didn't some kids drown a few years back trying to do that? Why don't we go down to the river? Have a beach day, he added, somewhat hopefully, in a lame attempt to change the subject. Poor Mike, Misty thought. The kid was afraid of his own shadow. The only thing swimming in that river will get us is tetanus shots, Misty replied, causing Chris and Travis to crack up. Travis caught her eye and she blushed. If only he wasn't her brother's best friend, and their town wasn't so small, she thought with a sigh. Chris stopped laughing first. Let's do it, he said finally. Go to the river? Mike asked, perking up. Chris gave him a look and shook his head. No, let's go to the swamp tonight. Go wake the dead. Aren't there leeches out there? Not to mention water moccasins, Misty asked, not liking the thought of getting bit by a snake. Or having to explain to their parents what they'd been doing out there in the middle of the night. We'll be careful, Chris replied. Besides, going out there is like a rite of passage. Everyone does it. Travis nodded. Yeah, my brother and his friends went out there back when they were in high school. Hell, he even took some of his friends from college out there last summer just to scare the shit out of them. So it's settled then. We'll go out there, have a couple of laughs and come back, Chris replied. I don't know, guys, Mike begged. We could get in trouble if we're caught out there. Misty sighed. Come on, Mike, you know you're going to come out with us anyway. So you might as well just agree. Besides, then you can brag to everyone back at school that you did it. It would go a long way to changing your reputation as a chicken shit. That's right. Hell, half the people that swear they've done it haven't been farther than their front door, Travis added, slapping a mayfly with one of his large dark hands, turning Misty's attention back to him. Chris stood up and leaned back against the wooden banister and picked at some of the peeling white paint that was all over the porch. That's right, Mike, you'll be one of the first in our class to do it. Probably the only all year besides us. Mike beamed. I never thought of it like that. Besides, the legend isn't real, right? The others laughed. That's what you're worried about? Travis asked, dumbfounded. Here I was thinking you were worrying about sinkholes, snakes, and shit. But the ghost of Mrs. Hernshaw? That's what's got you bitching and moaning. Chris doubled over, laughed, and it caught even Misty up in it for a moment. She had to lean back against the side of the house just to keep from falling over. It's not that funny, guys, Mike said to the others, taking his glasses so he could wipe them clean off the moisture from the humidity. Misty was the first to stop laughing. I don't know, Mike, it's kind of funny. Especially since you're supposed to be so smart, and you're over there afraid that Mrs. Hernshaw will pull you down into a watery grave tonight," Misty said dryly. "Don't worry, Mike, I'll keep you safe," Travis told him, laughing and flexing his biceps, causing Misty to stop laughing and stare for a moment. "You guys suck," Mike replied, getting up and going over to sit on top of the cooler. Chris nudged his sister with his foot. "Are you okay? You got a weird look on your face?" he asked, trying to see what she was looking at. Travis laughed. "She can't help it, man. The gun show took her breath away," he said, flexing his arms and striking several Mr. Universe poses. Misty turned beet red, causing Travis to laugh again. Chris looked at his best friend and his sister and just shook his head. Up the street they heard a screen door slam, then someone yelled out, "Mikey?" "Shit, that's my mother. What time are we heading out tonight?" he asked anxiously, not wanting to keep her waiting. 10 o'clock, down by the stop sign at the end of the street. That way we can head down to the swamp together, Chris told them, looking around at each of them to make sure they understood. Everyone nodded. "Plus it helps guarantee nobody gets cold feet," Chris added, giving Mike a hard look. "I guess we should go too," Misty said. Chris nodded. She was right. They had a longer walk than everyone else, since they lived several streets away, and already had to walk through the woods as it was. Travis hopped to his feet and helped Misty up. It surprised her to find how strong he was. Growing up, he had always been shorter than her. Now she had to look up at him. Chris cleared his throat and helped Travis dump the cooler and bring it back inside his house. Inside they could hear all the air conditioners struggling against the heat, but couldn't feel much of a difference. "See y'all at 10. Travis sighed miserably before disappearing into the house with a small wave. 2. By the time they walked from Travis's front porch to the woods, both Chris and Misty were covered in sweat. If you could call them that, it was less than an acre of trees that separated their house from Travis and Mikey's neighborhood. "At least it won't be so hot down in the swamp tonight," Chris told Misty hopefully. Misty just rolled her eyes. "You're forgetting about the mosquitoes, leeches, and everything else that's in the swamp. Plus, it's still a swamp, so you're still going to be dealing with the humidity." "Idiot," she said, shaking her head. "Oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Besides driving by it now and again, I don't think we've ever actually been in there," he mused. "No, Dad always talked about taking us down to see it, but I think he knows Mom would have a fit if he did. I mean, who takes a family day to the swamp anyhow?" she replied. "Well, besides the river no one swims in, it's the only other thing the town has going for it tourism-wise." "Tourism? Really?" she asked, trying not to laugh. "I'd hardly call a couple undergraduate researchers every couple of years tourism." Chris held up his hands in defense. "Hey, I'm just repeating what I heard. Besides, the 10 whole people that drive through town a year on their way to greener pastures seem to like it. Or at least they like taking pictures of it from their car," he added lamely. The shade from the trees gave them a brief respite from the heat. Not much, but enough to make the walk a little less miserable. In the winter, Misty enjoyed walking through this part of the woods, especially when the leaves changed colors and she could listen as they crunched beneath her feet. Now she just wanted to get home and cuddle up next to the air conditioner. From the way Chris was panting like a dog with each step, she was positive that he felt the same way. She hoped he was right about the heat tonight for all their sakes. She didn't know what would be worse, being miserable in a swamp or being hot and miserable in a swamp. At least Travis was coming, she thought, not sure how she felt about the way it made her heart flutter. Though she was brave enough to admit that the thought of being out after dark with him made going into the swamp seem a little less terrible. She was almost looking forward to it. If only they could find a way for just the two of them to go. Another impossibility for her. Not because of the town, but because having a sibling only a year older than her meant it basically glued them to the hip. Socially, anyway. The woods finally ended, and they were once again under the harsh glare of the sun. They quickly crossed the empty street and made their way up the short gravel driveway to their house. Standing in front of their old stately Victorian, they both sighed with relief, overjoyed to finally escape the summer heat. They went to the side door of the house, since the front door swelled and stuck in the heat. Misty didn't feel like fighting with it today. It always made them laugh when tourists drove through town and took pictures of everyone's homes. There was nothing special about their house. It looked like most of the other homes in Beacon Hills. Old and in constant need of repair. She had heard the tourists go on in Mel's diner about how stately all the houses in the area were. She failed to see anything stately about a drafty old house with noisy pipes that were always trying to leak. But to each their own. She figured some people just didn't have enough problems and wanted to add more. If only the tourists came down in the summer as they did in the fall, that way they could see all the air conditioners sticking out of everyone's stately old windows. Chris fumbled to get the house key out of his shorts pocket. "You know, you really should start carrying yours," he told her as he opened the door. Misty just shrugged. Why carry hers when he always had his? It was one of the few perks of having a brother. The cool air washed over them as they walked through the door. It was so cold that it forced them to stop and simply enjoy it. Too bad it wouldn't last once they got acclimated. They would just be hot again. She plopped down on an overstuffed love seat in the den. One of their mother's yard sale favorites, like most of the furniture in their house. Chris walked into the kitchen, and when he came back, he was carrying 2 soaking wet kitchen towels. "Thank you," Misty all but sang out as she pressed the cool wet rag to her face and neck, sighing in relief as she sank further into the love seat. Chris sat down on the recliner opposite of her. 5 minutes and then we need to pack before our parents get off work. I don't know about you, but I can't think of a good lie that involves flashlights and backpacks right now. At that, they both laughed. Down the street, they heard a car turn down the driveway across from them. Misty flicked open the shades and looked out, refusing to get up to do so. It was the Nolans turning, going down their driveway in whatever new luxury SUV they had this year. Chris would know he liked cars. She could not care less about them. What did interest her was that they had someone sitting in the back seat. "What is it?" Chris finally asked without looking up from where he lay, sprawled across the recliner. "The Nolans are back. Looks like Tabitha is spending the summer at home this year." "Really?" Chris asked excitedly, sitting up. "You think we should invite her out?" Misty shook her head. Growing up, she and Tabitha had been the best of friends. And the only 2 girls in the group. But after her brothers died, she'd changed and closed herself off from everyone, until eventually she'd convinced her parents to send her to an all-inclusive boarding school. One that usually allowed her to spend summers elsewhere. On the few occasions that she came back to town, she made a point of not so much as looking in their direction. "What's the point?" Misty asked. She probably wouldn't even come to the door. That had happened to Misty one time. Having Tabitha's mother tell her to leave had been heartbreaking, not to mention embarrassing. After that, she'd never gone over there again. For a moment Chris looked disappointed, then sank back into his chair. She sympathized. It wasn't like new girls were coming to town left and right. Her brother's dating life was just as stagnant as hers. 5 minutes came and went. Misty realized that if they didn't get moving, they never would. She got up and went to the hall closet, grabbing an old black book bag that was tucked away in the back. Shaking it to get the dust off, and to scare off any spiders that may have made a home in it while it was lying in the musty old closet, she wondered what else they'd need. "What flashlights do you want to take?" she asked. She heard the recliner shut, and Chris walked into the kitchen. "I'll get the ones under the sink. They're small and easier to carry. They're Dad's backup flashlights, so we shouldn't have to worry about him looking for them tonight for any reason." It made sense to her since their dad was notorious for packing away things around the house. Basically anything anyone else wanted to throw out, their dad brought home. Chris was right though, their dad had several large flashlights in the garage and even more upstairs, and God only knew how many he had out in the shed that probably didn't even work. She dreaded even thinking about it, and knew that it probably kept her mother up at night. Their mother often joked that one day they were going to find their father dead under all his junk garage. Misty figured she was only half kidding. "Should we bring one of the camping lanterns?" she asked, her hand pausing over it as Chris was busy putting the flashlights into the bag, along with several water bottles and a half-eaten bag of chips. He saw her eyeing the chips and sighing. He took them back out of the bag and set it aside. "Nah, I think we have enough, besides they don't put out a lot of light," Christ replied. "Plus that's more stuff we would have to carry through the swamp." "I hadn't thought of that. How far back is it?" she asked, taking one last look at the backpack and double-checking all the flashlight's batteries just in case. Chris shrugged. "I'm not sure, but we aren't going to the old house anyhow. In all the stories, they usually just get into the swamp, have a good scare and walk back. Then make up an even better story when they get back to school. Just make sure she doesn't see you. Or else," Misty said, laughing. $5 says Mike freaks out before we even get down there." At that, Chris laughed too. "Yeah, that's if he actually shows up." "You really think he'd bail?" she asked. It was a good question, since he'd never actually done it before. Even that time they'd snuck into the school after hours. To be fair, they had been in middle school and were looking for their permanent records on a dare, which didn't actually exist. They crawled in through a window just to find out that the office was locked, but even then Mike had shown up. Complaining and freaking out the entire time, but he still showed. "Wouldn't be the first time," he replied. "Remember the junkyard?" Oh yeah, she'd forgotten about that. Technically, he came along most of the way. She remembered Travis, Chris, and her taking one look at that huge barbed wire fence and that mean-ass dog on the other side, and turning their bikes back the way they came. Mike hadn't even biked down the path, insisting that he would wait by the road instead and warn them if anyone came their way. He didn't bail though. You jackasses didn't jump the fence either. Chris laughed, thinking about how wrong everything had gone that night. He shrugged. If he wasn't at least going to come to the fence, then he shouldn't have shown up at all. Misty was about to say something snarky back when they heard the unmistakable sound of their parents' car trudging up the gravel drive. They quickly stuffed the backpack out of sight. That night at dinner, Chris couldn't help himself. "Hey Dad, what's the legend about the lady in the swamp again?" he asked, shooting his sister a smug look. Misty kicked his leg under the table. Chris just smiled, deciding that without a doubt that she was going to get pushed into the swamp tonight. On accident, of course. See how much she likes that, he thought, still grinning ear to ear. Besides, it would serve her right to flirting with his best friend. Hell, he should push Travis in too for flirting back, he thought wryly. If they thought they were being sneaky, they were in for a rude awakening. Chris and Mike had been joking about it behind their backs for a while now. It wasn't even that Chris had anything against them dating. Just because he couldn't find anyone didn't mean he was going to stand in their way. But at the end of the day, she was his sister and Travis was his best friend, so he had to give them some shit about it. Their father paused for a moment and patted his stomach. "Well," he began, "the story goes that Mrs. Hernshaw was a young married woman with 3 or 4 children. The number changes with the tale. Supposedly, she'd heard her husband died during the First World War around the same time that the war ended. Unable to cope with his passing and the thought that she'd have to raise her children alone, she killed them. Most of the stories say she drowned them, but like I said, it depends on who tells it. So lo and behold, she was pretty shocked when her husband returned home. And so was he, after he discovered what she'd done. Apparently he drowned her too and then shot himself." "That's dreadful. What kind of conversation is this for supper time?" their mother asked. What kind of mother could kill her children? "You got to remember they were hard times around here back then, and I guess some people couldn't bear to watch their kids starve, but honestly, who knows? It's just a story. But even when I was a kid, people swore up and down that she rose out of the swamp every night at midnight and walked around looking for her more children to replace the ones she'd drowned." He finished with a burp. Misty had already stopped eating and was just pushing things around on her plate. "Dad, did you ever actually see her?" she asked. Their father chuckled, loud and deep. No, of course not. That's why it's called a legend. It's not real. I mean, the Hernshaw place is, but it's just a creepy old house in the middle of a murky swamp. One that was probably abandoned because of a bad well, foundation, or the like. But like all old houses in small towns, it got itself a story over the years. And kids like you have been scaring the shit out of each other with it since I was your age. He told them. Their mother clucked. Please, honey, don't swear at the table. Their father made apologetic noises. But Chris and Misty were looking at each other across the table. Did kids ever go missing? Chris asked. Down at the swamp? Their dad asked. Of course, kids drown down there over the years. Swamps are dangerous, you know. The water can get deep quickly, and the mud can suck you down faster than you can blink. Now that I think about it, that's probably how the story got started in the first place. It also doesn't help that many people your age like to sneak down there and drink. He said sternly. Misty knew that Chris was thinking the same thing she was. It was something that Mike definitely would not like. The plans were about to change. Now they had to see the house. 3. They left around 9:30, creeping out the front door, doing their best not to wake their parents. They smiled at each other. There was nothing quite like sneaking out of the house. It was something that they hadn't done in a long time, and she had to admit she really missed it. Even if back then the only reason they'd snuck out was to go hang at Travis or Mike's house. She had forgotten how much of a rush it was. Misty took a deep breath of fresh air and sighed contentedly as they stood outside. Chris was right. The humidity had dropped enough that it was no longer miserable. Perhaps their trip through the swamp wouldn't be too bad after all, she thought as they headed down the driveway. While crossing the street to head over to the wooded path, she looked up at the house across from them. The light in Tabitha's room was on, and it looked like someone was standing there. She rubbed her eyes and it was gone. She thought about telling Chris, but decided against it. Tabitha wouldn't tell their parents about them. She didn't care enough to, Misty thought with a venom that surprised even her. They walked in silence through the woods, neither of them wanting to set off one of the few neighborhood dogs. The last thing they wanted was some local busybody telling their parents they'd seen them out and about after dark. Travis met them down by the stop sign at the end of his street. They could see him from the glow of his cell phone as he flipped through his feed. He nodded at them in acknowledgement as they walked up. Together they all waited in silence. It was almost 20 minutes before Mike showed up. They watched amused as he did a weird crouch running up the street. It looked like he was acting out a scene in a bad spy movie, Misty thought as he ran up to them. Mike looked around, as though he expected to be caught at any moment. It was clear to his friends that he wanted to go home. Looking at his backpack, Misty had to stifle a groan. It was full to the point that he'd barely been able to zip it shut. If he actually needed anything out of there, she didn't see how he was going to open it. Pack enough? Travis asked sarcastically. Mike looked around like he was afraid someone was going to stop them at any moment. Yes, I've got water bottles, bandages, everything that we need in case of an emergency. He told them proudly. Travis looked like he wanted to say something else but for once was at a loss for words. Instead, he turned away, and they started heading down the road. Each one of them ducking out of sight of every passing car. Mike, as usual, was still nervous about being caught, even though they were far away from any of their houses. Which was funny to the others, since his parents were the ones least likely to be upset with him. If it meant getting him out of the house more, they'd probably even encourage it. How far is it? He asked everyone impatiently. Looking behind them nervously, even though Misty didn't even have to turn around to know that nothing was there. Calm down, man. Travis said impatiently. All we have to do is head down the hill and then cut through the woods into the swamp. So just chill. Mike was silent as they descended further down the hill. They stayed close to the wood line so they could dart into it just in case a vehicle passed them by. Mike wasn't the only one who was afraid of getting caught. The last thing any of them wanted to do was have to explain to a bored deputy what they were doing out at this time of night. Since there wasn't any actual crime around in Beacon Hills, the cops kept themselves busy with busting teenagers drinking underage and pulling people over for minor traffic violations. Even though it probably wasn't illegal, maybe a bit of trespassing on county property, they'd make a big show out of bringing them home and talking to their parents. Which would be the end of summer for Chris and her, if they were lucky. If not, they'd be shipped out to their grandparents' farm for the rest of the summer to bale hay and do chores. Once they hit the woods, everyone dug their flashlights out of their bags. Travis had brought his own. Mike forgot to grab one on his way out, even though he'd apparently brought everything else. "It's okay, we brought extras," Misty said with a sigh, handing him one from the bag. "Don't lose it," she said firmly. He nodded back. "Of course, I promise," he told her, and then immediately flicked it on, giving them a weak smile as he lit up the woods and blinded them all for a couple of seconds. Misty just shook her head, wondering if it would have been better if he had chickened out after all. Looking over at Travis and Chris, she could tell they had the same idea she did. If the lady in the swamp didn't show up, they could always have fun scaring the hell out of Mike. Usually she'd be against teasing him, but tonight he was getting on her last nerve. Her old feelings of unease came back in a rush as they entered the swamp. As soon as they stepped past the trees, the sounds of the barking dogs and other neighborhood noises disappeared. The atmosphere of the swamp seemed to suck them in, the trees that made up its canopies completely sheltering them from invasive noises. To her, it felt like they were stepping into another world. The swamp was nasty, much nastier than they'd thought. Every step they took brought squishing mud and water running into their tennis shoes. It was too late to turn back now. They'd have to clean them before their parents woke up. From the way the mud smelled and how thick it was, though, she had a pretty good feeling that they'd up having to chuck them. Good thing she'd worn an old pair, she thought miserably. "We should have worn boots," Mike moaned. Nobody said anything. For once he was right. "Hey, watch out, it gets slick up ahead," Travis shouted back from the front of the line, bobbing a little in the light as he almost slipped and fell himself. They walked single file through the pitch-black swamp, the dense vegetation making it so even the moon didn't shine through. Even with their flashlights on, it felt oppressive. It was as if the surrounding trees were closing in on them. All around them they could hear bullfrogs and other animal sounds. None of them had thought about leeches or snakes. Misty was quickly realizing that the spirit of Mrs. Hernshaw might be the least of their problems tonight. "How far do we have to go anyway, guys?" Misty asked, looking around, hoping she didn't sound too much like Mike. But at the same time really hoping that Travis and Chris were ready to turn around too. Last thing she wanted to do was get lost out here. Chris shrugged. It was Travis who finally answered her question. Up ahead, there should be a clearing almost like a pond in the center of the swamp, where the trees open up and there's almost like a pond or something in the middle of it. At least that's what my older brother told me after he and his friends came up here. "And that's the spot it happened at?" Mike asked them, his voice quivering slightly. "That's how he told it, but it's probably just because it's the most open spot around here. You know, a creepy-ass landmark of sorts," Travis replied, shining his light around and continuing down what he hoped was the right trail. Chris laughed. "Don't worry, Mikey, we won't let evil old Mrs. Hernshaw drown you in her scary pond." Misty shuddered and felt cold suddenly. "Guys, maybe we shouldn't talk about that stuff here," she said. "Getting scared?" Chris asked her snidely. "It's okay, Misty, I'll hold you if you get too scared," Travis responded from up front, making both Chris and him laugh. Even Mike chuckled weakly from the back. "You guys suck," Misty replied, kicking mud and water on Chris, which only made him laugh harder. She was happy that in the dim light no one had seen how red her face had got. If it were just the two of them, she might have taken Travis up on his offer. But she'd never pretend to be afraid in front of Chris. Especially not him. Her brother would never let her live it down. "Come on, guys, we don't have all night," Travis called back to them, already setting off farther into the cluster of trees. They seemed to swallow him up. If not for the flashlight bobbing in front of him, Misty was sure that they would have lost all sight of him. reinforcing the need for all of them to stick together. Even Mike had stopped lagging and put forth a greater effort to keep up with the group. None of them wanted to get lost out in the swamp. They soon found themselves at the edge of the clearing, just like Travis had said they would. In front of them was a pool of almost fathomless dark water. Tonight was a new moon, but even in the dark, Misty could see the mirror-like sheen of the water. No wonder it was known as the source of the legend, Misty thought. It had to be the deepest area of the swamp they'd just waded through. She was happy to have firm ground underneath her feet again, but even she didn't want to get too close to that pool. To prove a point, Travis and Chris tried to hit the bottom with long sticks and failed. The dark water easily swallowing up the longest tree branches they could find. "Jesus, that's deep," Chris remarked. "That's an understatement," Misty muttered under her breath. Mike kept flicking his flashlight around at every little noise. "Yeah, well, maybe you guys shouldn't get too close to the edge then," he hissed. Travis grunted. "Don't worry. Besides, it's not like we don't know how to swim." "Now what do we do?" Mike asked. Voicing what they were all thinking, if it was up to Misty, they'd turn around and go back right now. Everything about this place just felt wrong. Or are we just going to stand around trying to find out how deep the damn water is? He added. "I guess now we have to call her up," Chris said, his voice catching a little as he did. Misty didn't blame him. She'd laughed it off earlier too, but now, standing here, everything felt different. With the water less than 10 feet away, she had to agree with Mike. It felt like a bad idea. Misty could feel the hair on the back of her neck stand up as she got goosebumps. Yeah, she didn't like this idea at all. But there was no way she was going to admit that now. She didn't want to chicken out in front of Travis. "Hey, Hernshaw, look, a bunch of children standing by your puddle," Travis yelled, suddenly making them all jump. "Dude, what the hell?" Chris said, grabbing his arm. "Give some warning next time." Travis pushed him off. "Calm down, man. Look at you guys getting all freaked out over nothing." He threw a rock out into the middle of the water, causing a big splash and ripples to break its steely surface. Chris soon joined in. "Come on, you old bitch, here we are," he shouted out. Travis and him took turns throwing things into the water and laughing. Mike looked like he was about to be sick. "Look guys, it's not working. We all had a good laugh, but I'm wet and miserable, so can we please get out of the swamp now?" Misty pleaded. "Then what's that?" Mike asked, pointing out past Travis and Chris to the center of the water. His face was white as a sheet. "Stop playing around, Mike, Misty started and then saw what he was pointing at. "Had enough of this," she finished in a barely audible whisper. They all got quiet as they watched a lone figure pull itself from the dark water, its arms rising as it stood on top of the unmoving water. A skeletal-looking apparition in a long black dress that seemed to flow with the ripples of the water. "Forget this," Chris said, running back the way they came. He pulled Misty as he ran past. Mike and Travis both followed suit. This time, they didn't even try to avoid mud or water. Plunging full speed through the swamp, branches clawed at their faces, and leaves and mud clung to them from all directions. But the only thing they cared about was getting the hell out of there. 4. By the time they made it back to the road and out of the swamp, all of them were gasping for breath. "What the hell was that back there?" Travis asked, almost doubled over. Mike shrugged, looking like he was doing his best to try not to cry. Everyone tried to find something else to look at while he wiped at his eyes. Misty didn't blame him. She didn't think she'd ever been so scared of something in her entire life. She wished they'd kept running. Even now, it felt like something malevolent was peering out of the swamp at them. The very air seemed to ooze a sinister aura that made the hairs stand up on the back of her neck. Misty turned around to face it, not comfortable having her back towards the trees. It was empty, but she knew what she'd seen. Just like the others, Misty had watched as a figure climbed out of the water, only to stand on top of it, which was impossible. "I don't know. What do you think it was?" Chris replied, refusing to make eye contact. Misty knew her brother well enough to realize that he would never admit to seeing the figure. Travis shot him a worried look. Probably just a fish or some shit jumping out of the water. Big-ass fish, Misty muttered sarcastically, knowing that what they saw in the swamp wasn't anything close to a fish. Mike whined. Guys, I think I lost my shoe in the swamp, he said, pointing at his feet, which revealed one muddy shoe and one very muddy sock-clad foot. Misty looked at herself and then at the others. They were all completely covered in mud. And where there wasn't mud, sticks and leaves clung to them. Damn. Forget being able to just wipe down her shoes. Shit, they were screwed. Now she and Chris were going to have to hide these clothes until their parents left long enough to throw them in the wash. If not, they were going to have a lot of explaining to do. Well, do you want to go back and get it? Travis asked him snidely. Mike shook his head and looked away. I have another pair. He mumbled to no one in particular. What if it was you know? Travis asked after a second, quickly disregarding his own fish theory. Oh guys, we all need to calm down. I mean, come on, you don't really think that was a ghost? It had to be someone pulling one over on us, Misty said hopefully. She wanted either her brother or Travis to cop to it. But they both looked as scared as she felt. Besides, she knew that if one of them had done it, they'd have taken credit for it by now. They all looked at her. Who? Mike asked, sounding hopeful. He was clearly ready to take any alternative explanation that would help him sleep better tonight. I don't know, but I'm sure someone will take credit for it. I mean, I would. Tomorrow we can go back out and check. Find out who it was and prank them right back. She told them more confidently than she felt, especially since she didn't want to go back to that swamp ever again. Deep down, she didn't believe it was a prank anyway. She didn't know what she believed. All she knew was that they'd seen something down there. Something that they couldn't explain, and something she never wanted to see again. Chris nodded. Yeah, but let's go during the day if we're going. That way we can see how they did it. For that kind of effect, they'd have needed ropes or pulleys or something, he said, though it was clear from his tone of voice that even her brother didn't believe that anyone around here had put that much thought into a prank. Especially since they had told no one they were going in the first place. If they were going to go back out there and check it out, he was right. They should go during the day. Slowly they all made their way up the street back to the center of town. This time they took the road and stayed under the streetlights, not caring if anyone saw them or not. It wasn't like anyone would be out in Beacon Hills this time of night. But either way, it felt safer to be under the light. Part of her almost wished they were caught just so they wouldn't have to walk home in the dark. Her dad was always fond of pointing out that the whole town closed down at around 8. She listened, hoping to hear anything besides the sound of their feet on the pavement. Not even a dog barked in the distance. They didn't even turn off their flashlights when they made it to Travis and Mike's street. The two of them practically running to their respective houses, without a single glance back at Chris and Misty. We could walk around, Chris suggested as they stood looking into the dark woods separating them from their nice, safe house. Misty shook her head. No, we might as well get this over with. Besides, this is the fastest way, and the sooner we get home the better. Putting one foot in front of the other, she took the first steps onto the wooded path, leaving Chris to catch up. Even though their flashlights illuminated the path in front of them, it still felt like the shadows were closing in on them. They all walked as fast as they could through the path, neither one of them wanting to spend another minute in the dark woods. Suddenly there was a loud crunch to the right of them, like someone or something stepping on a stick. They stopped and shined their flashlights all around, trying to find the culprit. What was that? Chris hissed as they looked around. How should I know? Misty replied. Looking around, they saw nothing. We're getting as bad as Mike out here, she said with a small laugh. More from nerves than actual humor. Guess you're right, Chris replied, still shining his light around. The sound of movement came from out in the woods came again. This time it was louder and much closer than before. The sound of something big, like a person moving slowly, knocking things out of its path as it does so. More twigs snapped, and a sudden cold wind cut through the humid night air, raising goosebumps on both of the siblings. They both shivered and looked at one another. Whatever was moving around in the woods was getting closer, and it sounded like it was heading right for them. Something told Misty that under no circumstances did she want to see it. She nodded at Chris and they took off running. Not sprinting, not jogging, but honest-to-God pedal to the metal running. At one point Misty had to remind herself to breathe as her vision clouded with black spots. With every step they took, the sound of movement in the woods seemed to get louder, as though whatever they had heard had chased them. They didn't know if it was true or not, because right then, neither one of them was brave enough to turn around and look back. Misty honestly didn't want to see. She was too afraid of what might be standing there waiting for her. Too afraid that what they saw down in the swamp tonight wasn't a prank after all, even if she didn't want to admit it. They could see their house up ahead in the distance as the woods thinned out. Just seeing it was enough to give them the energy to run the rest of the way. Chris drew up short and wheeled around to catch Misty before they both shot straight through the front door. "What?" she gasped, completely out of breath. The outside light above them flickered, and for a moment they both stood still as they waited for it to go out and leave them in the dark. She sighed in relief when it didn't. Chris too was out of sorts. He kept looking behind them, but there was nothing there. He hoped it had just been their imagination after all. "Look, we can't go running into the house and banging around. Do you want to get in trouble?" He whispered angrily, doing his best not to raise his voice. Misty wanted to kick herself for forgetting. The last thing she wanted to do was make an awful night even worse. Hell, the last thing either of them needed right now was to be chewed out by their parents and grounded for the rest of the summer. Instead, they walked to the back of the house and took their shoes and socks off in the shed. That way, there wouldn't be any questions, and they wouldn't accidentally track mud in the house. Then, using old rags from their dad's toolbox, they did their best to get some of the mud off. It didn't work too well. Misty was just glad she hadn't worn anything nice, because she honestly doubted a lot of the thick black mud that was clinging to both of them was going to come out. Hopefully, it would be easier to clean once it dried. By the back door, Chris stopped her from going inside again. "Misty, you know that I didn't have anything to do with what happened tonight, right?" he asked her, almost pleadingly. "I know you're not that smart," she said smugly, and gave him a playful punch on the shoulder. "What about Travis?" He shrugged. "I don't know, I don't think so. If it was Travis, he'd have started making fun of us by now." "Then who, Mike?" she asked him, almost laughing at the thought. Chris smiled half-heartedly, really wishing that he could believe that. "That I highly doubt. I didn't want to say anything back there, but I think he pissed himself when we're running back through the woods. So I highly doubt he was pranking us, unless he's a better actor than any of us have ever given him credit for." "Maybe somebody's older cousins, siblings?" she asked. "And they knew we were going down there tonight?" he asked her. "Shit. I don't know, Chris. I don't know what we saw down there. All I know is I'm scared, and I want to go get this mud off of me and try to go to sleep. We can play 20 questions tomorrow." "I don't know about you, but I'm leaving all the lights on tonight," he told her, sliding past her through the doorway and into the house. "Me too," she muttered, following him. Slowly they locked the door behind them and trudged up the stairs to their rooms, both of them knowing that they weren't going to get any sleep that night. Or any time soon, for that matter. As the porch light went out, neither one of them saw the lone figure standing in the driveway watching them, or the light from the bedroom window across the street flicker off. 5. Mike pulled off his muddy shoes and set them out on the porch, knowing full well that his mother would see them in the morning. They were the pair that he used to help her in the garden, and he doubted that she'd even ask about them. Though he'd still clean them off best in the morning, just to get as much of the foul-smelling mud off that he could. He didn't even really care about his shoes, or being caught by his parents anymore. And he especially didn't care what the others said. He saw something out there and he knew it. Something awful. The others did too, he knew they did, whether or not they wanted to admit it. Mike couldn't remember ever seeing Travis that freaked out before, and they'd known each other since they were 5. He'd almost asked him to come over and spend the night tonight, as they'd made their back to their own houses, but didn't want Travis to make fun of him for it. Now he wished he had just done it. Travis probably would have said yes, sure he would have made fun of him. But it would have been worth it not to have to be alone tonight. He just wanted to sink into his bed and forget this whole thing had ever happened. Az walked into his house, which was completely dark save for the microwave light on in the kitchen. His parents were always going on about saving electricity. If he'd been smarter, he'd have turned on a light or something on his way out. That way he wouldn't have to wander around in the dark. He thought of the figure again and wished he hadn't. It had been a person, not a fish. There had been no splashing. The water had been completely still, like a mirror. Mike shuddered just thinking about it, and tiptoed into his house. Part of him almost wished his parents would wake up just so he wouldn't be alone. Slowly the familiarities of home settled over him, and Mike felt a little better. It was comforting having the sights and smells of the swamp replaced with the AC and his mother's Yankee candles. He could even still faintly make out the smells from dinner, but food was the last thing on his mind. But then his stomach gave a little growl. His mom had fried up some of the catfish Chris and him had pulled out of the river a couple of days ago. It almost tempted him to pull the leftovers out of the fridge. Smelling that, it was hard to think about a ghost. Even though he made sure to turn the lights on as he walked through the house. Not caring if his parents yelled at him about the electric bill in the morning or not. Mike wasn't taking any chances. Having all the lights on just made him feel safer. Kind of like how carrying his ratty old blanket used to make him feel safer as a kid. Mike wished that he still had that blanket now, but his parents had finally packed it up and put it away in the attic. And there was no way he was going up there tonight for any reason. As silently as he could, he made it to his room, easing the door shut and locking it. He really didn't want to have to deal with his parents tonight, on top of everything else. Pulling off all his clothes, he buried them deep in the hamper. They reeked of mud and brackish, salt water and other swamp smells he wasn't even going to attempt to identify. Even buried in his hamper, they still made the room reek. Mike looked at his nice clean bed, and realized that he had to take a shower before he got in it. He had mud streaked up both of his arms, and his feet and legs were splattered with it as well. At least school was over with and he could sleep in tomorrow, so staying up another half hour to jump in the shower couldn't hurt. Not to mention thinking about it, he really should check for ticks. And what were the other things Misty had said? Leeches, he thought and shivered, hoping he didn't find one wriggling around on him. One perk of being an only child was that he got a bathroom all to himself, and it was far enough away from his parents' room that he didn't have to worry about it waking them up. But while he had his own bathroom and all the doors in the house were locked, he still took the time to lock the door just to make himself feel better. The hot water from the shower felt good, and after finding a couple of ticks, he was glad that he had taken it. Especially with the amount of mud and other things that had been caked in his hair, from running through the trees and bushes. He'd have to clean the shower in the morning. The mud, twigs and filth were all pooling around the drain. His pristine tub now looked like a camp shower from summer camp. One in need of a cleaning. He was surprised at the amount of grime that had come of him. Now though, he felt clean and refreshed and had forgotten why he was so freaked out in the first place. It wasn't like any of them were going to go back down there. No matter what the others said, he knew they wouldn't push it. There was a soft creak, like someone had walked into the bathroom over by the sink. But that was impossible. He had locked the door and the only other people in the house were his parents, and there was no way that they'd just barge in. This was too faint, kind of like someone was sneaking about. Stop it, he told himself. His heart pounded in his chest as he thought about the figure pulling itself from the black water. He took a deep breath and reminded himself that it had to be his mind playing tricks on him. Like every house in Beacon Hills, his was old, and it creaked and moaned all the time. That thought made him feel better, as he bent down to turn off the water. Well, it did, until the shower curtain started sliding open slowly. At first he didn't realize what was happening, until he heard the scrape of the shower rings pulling along the rod slowly. Mike felt his mouth moving but wasn't able to get words out as he watched the curtain open itself. Taking a deep breath, he grasped the curtain and pulled it all the way to the side, revealing a completely empty bathroom. The door was still shut and locked. "What the hell?" he said out loud, looking around. It wasn't a huge bathroom. There certainly wasn't any place a person could hide. But he knew what he'd just witnessed. The curtain had moved all by itself. He slid the curtain back in place and decided that it was time to get out of the shower. He was exhausted and scared. Mike just wanted to pull the covers over his head and pretend like tonight was nothing more than a terrible dream. The curtain suddenly slid all the way open, and the temperature in the room dropped to where he could see his breath. Mike stood there shivering, his back up against the shower wall. Yet not even that was as awful as the thing standing in front of him. This time the bathroom wasn't empty. The light flickered once, and when it came back on, the figure was still standing there. Mike was so scared he couldn't even move as it slowly started to walk towards him. If this was a joke, it had officially gone way too far. Standing in front of him was a corpse. An honest-to-God corpse. Its milky white eyes staring at him malevolently, and its desiccated hands reaching out towards him. "This isn't funny," he shouted, but if anyone heard him, they didn't answer. As it moved towards him, he knew it wasn't a joke, it was her. Mrs. Earnshaw. They'd called her up from the deep, and now she was coming for them. Just like the legend, how had he let the others talk him into it? Tears streamed freely down Mike's face as Mrs. Earnshaw's feet dragged themselves across the old tile floor. He could even hear the fabric from her long, dark, torn dress as it pulled along behind her. He shook his head no, but it was too late. Mike tried to fight as Mrs. Earnshaw's icy hands grabbed him. All bone and sagging flesh, but they were as strong as iron. She held on to him for a moment, staring deeply into his eyes, her breath on his face. The smells of swamp and rot oozed from her as she leaned into him, and then as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. Mike was alone in the bathroom. He looked all around him, shaking with fear as he stepped out of the tub. Wondering where his parents were, didn't they hear him scream? By now they should be busting down the door. He knew what he'd seen had been real. Of course it had been, because there on the floor he could see them, muddy footprints made by what he knew to be long dead feet. He was shaking with his back up against the shower wall, and something warm was making its way down his leg, but Mike didn't care. He just wanted to get out of the bathroom. But as his hands reached out to grip the wall so he could climb out, the faucet over the tub turned on. Gulping, he felt fresh tears gather in his eyes as he turned around to look. "No," he moaned pitifully, watching the dark muddy swamp water as it rose in his tub. It rushed in around his legs as he jumped out of the tub, not caring if he dried off or slipped on the floor. The smell of the swamp invaded the small bathroom and was almost enough to make him gag. He went to back away, not taking his eyes off the still water, which seemed unending yet didn't flow over the rim. It was so dark he could barely see into it. He was almost to the door. Then he'd make a run for it and tell his parents. He'd tell them everything, anything, as long as it made whatever was happening stop. But before he could take another step back, Mrs. Earnshaw, in all her ghastly glory, shot out of the water and grabbed him. Bony hands dug into his shoulders and dragged him forwards over the side of the tub into the dark bathwater. Using the weight of her emaciated, skeletal body, she pushed him down further into the tub. Mike screamed and choked as the water rushed into his mouth, nose, and lungs. He twisted and looked up at her lipless smile, all rotted flesh and gleaming bone, as she shoved his head back down into the tub as he tried to gasp for breath. Soon his thrashing ceased, and as the world turned to black all around him, Mike swore that Mrs. Earnshaw was laughing. 6. Tabitha Noland had come back to town for the summer. Not because she had wanted to. The last thing she ever wanted to do was to set foot back in Beacon Hills, but her parents had insisted, making it clear that this year she didn't have a choice of spending the summer away from the town and away from them. She couldn't stand this place, couldn't stand the way people looked at her here. Like she was some fragile little doll that would break at the first sign of trouble. She'd been so little when her brother's accidents happened that it almost felt like a dream. And for a while she'd almost been convinced that's all it had been. Almost. The medications the doctors had given her had helped that a lot over the years. Now she barely dreamed about the things she saw, or anything for that matter. Sometimes if she thought about it long enough, she could conjure up the memory of that night, but after how her parents had reacted the first time, she knew better than to talk about it. Many people, her parents included, hadn't believed her. They'd chalked it all up to a child's overactive imagination. The doctors had explained it away as a coping mechanism. But Tabitha knew what she'd seen the night Paul drowned before Randy had disappeared. She knew exactly what she'd seen stalking him across the house, seen it out of the corner of her eye when it thought no one was looking. It had been a monster. The monster that killed her brothers had haunted her dreams a lot over the years. Until the medications had made her numb to it all. That was until now, for the first time in years since they'd finally started giving her the good stuff Tabitha had dreamed of about the swamp lady. For the first time since she'd convinced her parents to let her go to school far away from this town, the nightmare was back. The same one she'd overheard her brother Paul talk to his friends about before they all went missing or died. The only thing she couldn't understand was why. Tabitha would have blamed it on the fact that she was back after so long, but the dreams had started while she was still in school. Something that had never happened before. She'd wanted to stay, but her parents hadn't allowed it. Something else that was strange, they were usually fine with her staying at school over breaks, or going to her grandparents. After the deaths of her brothers, Tabitha's parents had been adamant that nothing would change. They tried to make her go to public school, but in the end, that had become too problematic. She couldn't stand the questions, the stares, the shallow sympathy from the students and teachers. And after a multitude of parent-teacher conferences, they'd finally caved and allowed her to attend an out-of-state boarding school. They also didn't know how to cope with losing 2 children and raising her at the same time. While it also had its own share of problems, Tabitha liked it there. Not because the people were different, but because she wasn't constantly reminded of her brother's deaths. Unlike at home, where her parents refused to even change their rooms around. Paul had died and Randy was never found, but Tabitha knew he was dead too. He'd gone out after the swamp and never returned. She'd told her parents, but they didn't believe her. Or maybe they didn't want to. The same part of them that refused to so much as pick the laundry off the floor of the boys' room must still hope that he was going to someday walk back through the front door. That would never happen because they buried her brothers side by side in Beacon Hills Cemetery. At least one was, the other was an empty casket, something that their therapist had told them would help them gain a sense of closure. Tabitha had closure. She was the only one who knew what killed them. She lay on her bed and tried to go to sleep, but couldn't. She didn't want to have the dreams again. Twice before school ended, she'd woken up screaming in the middle of the night, which was a great way to get a single room at a private school. It was also a good way to guarantee that she'd never had a lot of friends. Her parents had decided that coming back here for the summer would help. Usually, her parents let her stay with one of her grandparents for the summer. Their farm was several towns over, and Tabitha enjoyed staying there. But this year, whether or not she liked it, she was spending the summer in the house with her parents, who looked at her like she might break any minute. Her room was practically unchanged as well. She'd spent so little time there that she'd never really gotten into the whole decorating thing. In fact, it was something that she'd always considered doing. If she was going to waste her summer back home, then she didn't see why it couldn't be productive. She could make her room special. That way, it wouldn't feel so bad when she spent the rest of the summer nestled in it, like a prisoner. It was well past midnight. She needed to go to bed. Instead, she sat by her window reading a book, trying in vain to make herself tired. Outside, she saw movement in the driveway across the street. 2 figures running up the driveway. Chris and Misty. Tabitha thought with a small pang in her heart. She and Misty used to be best friends. But when Tabitha had decided that she had to leave, the first thing she'd done was push the other girl away. One of the few things she'd actually regretted about leaving. She watched them, wondering why they'd snuck out. Maybe there was a party in town, though she seriously doubted it. After a couple of minutes, they got inside and shut the door. Tabitha was about to go back to her book when she saw another figure emerge from the darkness. The figure stood in the middle of the driveway and seemed to stare at the house. Tabitha felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up and quickly got away from the window. It wasn't real, she told herself as she went back to laying in bed. The swamp lady couldn't be back. Her heart was beating like a jackhammer as she tried fitfully to get to sleep. This time, though, she left the lights on. Tabitha decided that today was the day she was going to redo her room. She needed to take her mind off of last night, and an extensive project would just that. At least that's what she hoped would happen. As she went down the stairs to tell her parents about it, she repeated her pitch in her mind. She figured they would be somewhat happy, since she'd done nothing but sulk since they had forced her to stay there for the summer. Walking slowly into the dining room, she could hear them talking. Her father's voice slightly slurred, an unpleasant reminder that once again he'd probably spent most of the day drinking instead of doing anything productive. But that was another thing that Tabitha had stopped caring about a long time ago. "It's a real shame," her father slurred as her mother sipped her coffee almost mechanically, not really looking at him. Her mom sighed, and so close to Randy's age too. She replied sadly. Hearing her brother's name made her curious. Who was close to Randy's age? Tabitha asked. She walked into the room. Her father blinked as though remembering that she existed. Something that he usually did whenever she spoke to him. And her mother made that pinched little pained face she did whenever Tabitha mentioned one of her brothers out loud. Whenever she did, it took everything Tabitha had not to swing on her. She couldn't stand it, the way they treated her, or the way they treated themselves. They acted like she hadn't lost them too. "A boy up the street passed away last night. In the neighborhood next to ours," her mother said finally. Tabitha had to think about who that could be. She hadn't lived there in a while, but Beacon Hills wasn't exactly the type of place that people were moving to. And if they were Randy's age now, there was a good chance that she'd been in elementary school with them. "Mike or Travis?" she asked her mother. She blinked, confused, as if she couldn't believe her daughter could remember such a thing. "I believe it was Mike, something or another. Such a shame, only child too," her mother said. That had to be Mikey then, Tabitha thought, knowing that Travis had older siblings. Not that she didn't trust her mother's own memory, it was just if her father was into his bourbon, then her mom had probably started the morning with a good handful of antidepressants. As long as they left her alone, though she didn't care, she'd have to wait until they were a little more sober to bring up redoing her room. Not that they'd have a problem with it, anyway. They'd be just as happy for her to have something to do that would keep her out of their hair. She realized this was the most time they'd spent around each other in years. And apparently, she wasn't the only one who didn't know how to handle it. "What happened to him?" Tabitha asked before they could change the topic to something more mundane. Her father made a pained look at his mother, clearly asking permission before continuing. Finally, her mother nodded, and he turned to her, his sad, beady little eyes locking onto her own. "He drowned, honey, the damnedest thing, drowned right there in his bathtub, just like..." Before he could finish, her mother hissed at him. But he didn't have to. She knew exactly who he was going to compare Mike to. And she also knew what it meant. Her dreams were right. The swamp lady was back. And she was after Chris and Misty. 7. Misty woke up a lot earlier than usual the following morning. She'd been exhausted by the time they got back in the house, and had fallen asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow. As she stretched and pulled her sore body from the safe, warm bed, she remembered everything that had happened the night before. For a moment she hoped that maybe last night had just been a crazy dream, but then she saw her muddy socks on the floor. Damn, so much for that, she thought, wondering if she'd ever be able to truly forget what they saw last night. She'd hoped that a good night's sleep would have done the trick. That in the morning light, she'd be able to better understand what they'd seen in the swamp. She shivered as she thought about the figure walking across the water coming towards them. Without a doubt, Misty knew she'd seen a ghost, and not just any ghost. Mrs. Hernshaw, the urban legend, come to life. Climbing out of the bed, she showered quickly. She'd meant to do it last night, but when she got to her room, she kind of passed out. Because of that, there was now dried mud on her sheets, which meant even more laundry for her to do. While there was a shocking amount of mud and twigs somehow still on her, Misty figured it wasn't as bad as she expected. They'd done a pretty good job of getting the bulk off of them before they came in. She'd be sure to mention the ticks though. Finding them had been unpleasant, so she'd be nice and give her brother a heads up. Getting out of the shower, she stripped down her bed and grabbed her dirty clothes from the other night, figuring she might as well put everything in the wash now. She wasn't planning on leaving the house unless she had to. At this point, she really hoped the others decided to do the same thing. She didn't really care if it was a trick or not. The last thing she wanted to do was go back into that swamp. When she came out of her room, Chris was standing there, clearly waiting for her, looking just as resigned as she felt. Unlike her, however, he had deep bags under his eyes, making it clear he didn't get much sleep last night. If any at all. "Don't forget our shoes out in the shed," he whispered, trying to keep his voice down, both of them all too aware of their parents' conversation in the kitchen as they walked across the hall and over to the stairs. She simply nodded in response. Misty didn't feel like talking about last night. Not yet anyway. Besides, the last thing she wanted to do was accidentally give their parents a heads up that they'd snuck out. Together they went downstairs. At the foot of the stairs they could hear their parents talking angrily, which Misty just realized was weird because they should both be at work this time of day. Even weirder was the fact that they hadn't made breakfast, which was a staple of theirs when they stayed home. It was something they'd done ever since Chris and her had been in diapers. Instead of breakfast, they found both of their parents sitting at the table with untouched cups of coffee in front of them. Their mother was pale and had tears running down her cheek. Misty swallowed nervously, and she and Chris shared a look. Both of them wondering the same thing. Which family member had died? The last time they had walked in on a scene like this was 2 years ago when their grandmother had passed. Whatever this was, they knew that it was over a lot more than them sneaking out last night. Neither one of them talked as Chris and Misty took a seat at the table opposite their parents. Their father grumbled and cleared his throat, like he always did when he was about to give them a bit of bad news. He looked up from the table and his mug finally at them. "Sit down, kiddos, I got something I want to ask you and it's really serious," he said to them, finally breaking the silence at the table. Chris and Misty looked at each other, neither of them sure what this could be about. They'd expected their parents to just blurt out whatever was going on. They couldn't remember the last time that their parents had asked them anything serious. "What's up, Dad?" Chris asked before Misty had a chance. She kept looking at her mother, hoping that maybe she would give something away. Were they in trouble? She wondered but couldn't think of anything else that they'd done. Did their parents know they'd snuck out last night? Their father cleared his throat again loudly, the way he always did when he was speaking about something that made him uncomfortable. "Are you guys doing drugs? And please don't lie to me," he asked, his eyes pleading with them to tell the truth. "No," they both said in unison, confused by their father's question. If their parents weren't being so weird at the moment, they probably would have laughed at it. "What about Mike? Did he ever use them?" their father asked, looking between them. "I know his parents gave him a lot of leeway, being an only child and all. The way he always did when he suspected they were up to something. Or knew more than they were letting on." Misty had to suppress a laugh. "Mike on drugs? He wouldn't even take Advil because he'd read the side effects on the back of the bottle." The thought of him doing anything like that was laughable, which made it that much more terrifying that her parents were asking about them. "Not that I know of. Mike would never do anything like that. The guy is afraid of his own shadow," Chris told them, looking to Misty for support. She shook her head, baffled at where her parents' questions were coming from. "Mike was a good kid. Sure, he was a little goofy, and at times was a total stick in the mud, but he was their friend, and he sure as hell wasn't on drugs. In Beacon Hills, they were lucky if they could sneak the occasional beer. It wasn't like there was a big party scene around town, it just wasn't possible. If Mike was hanging out with new people, they'd be the first people to know about it. Besides, if parties were happening and Mike knew about it, then sure as hell wouldn't be spending their night trekking around a muddy old swamp. Misty thought miserably. Why do you guys think Mike is on drugs? Misty asked, looking between both her mother and father, confused. Their mother got up and went to the stove to make breakfast. Her hands were still shaking slightly as she tried to crack eggs into a pan, but the siblings knew their mother well enough to know that more bad news was on the way, and she didn't want to be at the table for it. She always made their father give them any bad news. Usually so they wouldn't have to see her cry. Misty did her best to steel herself for the emotional blow she assumed was coming. Look. Their father started clearing his throat again. Mike passed away last night. His parents found Mike this morning face down in his bathtub. Their father said. He's dead. He told them, and now you know why we asked you about the drugs. Chris shook his head and Misty tried not to cry. There's no way he could be dead. We just saw him. Chris blurted out. Misty's eyes went wide. The last thing they needed on top of this was to get in trouble as well. When? Their father asked. Yesterday, before dinner, Misty added before Chris could put his foot any further into his mouth. And you saw nothing suspicious? Their father asked them. No needles, or other paraphernalia? What about a bong? They both shook their heads. The realization that Mike was dead slowly sinking in. Mike, who had been their friend for as long as any of them could remember. Who had big plans and dreams of getting out of this town and making a life for himself. Now he was just gone. And all his dreams and plans were gone with him. There was a lump in Misty's throat. She suddenly felt bad for all the times that they'd teased him. Of course, she also knew that some of her tears were for herself because whatever happened to Mike, she couldn't help but feel it was just the beginning. They'd really done it, they'd raised Mrs. Hernshaw, and now she was going to come for them one by one. While their mother laid breakfast out in front of them, both siblings were lost in their thoughts. The whole family ate in complete silence. The siblings both thinking the same thing. How were they supposed to protect themselves from a murderous ghost? Dash 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 dash. 8. After breakfast, their parents left them alone, realizing that they needed to grieve in their own way. They promised to let them know when Mike's parents set up the funeral details. Just thinking about Mike in a casket brought fresh tears to Misty's eyes. It wasn't fair. They hadn't understood what they were doing, and now Mike, the person who hadn't even wanted to go in the first place, had paid the price. And according to the legend, they were next. She knew it was true, she could feel it in her very bones. A sense of unease that she couldn't shake. Chris had made it clear as they lounged around the house that he didn't want to talk about it. He wasn't ready to accept the truth, and honestly, neither was she. Travis came over later that day. It wasn't unexpected. Whenever something bad happened, they always gathered together. Safety in numbers, like them. He looked awful. Like he had been crying minutes before coming over, or even while knocking on the door. She doubted she looked much better. Misty had been crying on and off throughout the day, and was reminded of how swollen and puffy her eyes were every time she blinked. Hey man, what's up? Chris asked solemnly as he answered the door, trying to keep his voice from wavering. The last thing he wanted to do was crack up in front of his friend. Travis looked nervous. Are your parents around? He asked them, casting furtive glances inside the house. As though he was waiting for someone or something to pop out at any moment. His eyes, which Misty had thought were bloodshot from crying, were in fact swollen and sunken in, as if he hadn't gotten a wink of sleep last night. Chris shook his head. No, they went with Mike's parents over to the funeral home. They didn't want to be alone, so our parents volunteered to head over there with them and help them make arrangements. He mumbled. That seemed to take the last ounce of strength out of Travis, as he sank heavily down onto the couch across from Misty. "Oh man, what are we going to do?" he pleaded. "It's going to be us next, y'all know that, right?" Chris stopped pacing and looked at him. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though deep down he already knew. "Didn't they tell you how he died?" Travis practically shouted. "He drowned? In his shower, Chris. His shower, man. Do you know how impossible that is? There's not enough standing water in the average American shower to drown in. I know because I've been looking it up all day," he moaned. "You guys saw her too. It's just like the story. She came for him and now we're next." Okay. Just slow down," Chris said. He finally stopped pacing and sat down across from Travis. Misty stayed where she was, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them, to ward off the sudden chill she felt when thinking of Mrs. Hernshaw. A name that she never wanted to say again, or hear for that matter. Especially out loud. What if she came when called? Misty thought and shuddered. "Don't you see, man? It's her. She's coming after us now, one by one," Travis told him, his head in his hands. Sitting across from Chris, he was practically trembling with fear, something that neither of them had ever seen him do before. For a moment, Chris was worried that Travis was going to start crying again, mostly because he was afraid that he would join in. But also because he didn't know what he could say to comfort him. Because he was afraid that Travis was right, and they were all going to die. "We don't know that, right? Maybe the stories are wrong?" Chris asked, knowing but not wanting to say it out loud that they seemed to be turning out to be a little too true. "Please let this all be a bad dream," Chris pleaded silently to himself. "Mrs. Hernshaw," Travis all but whispered, looking around as he did so, as though she might appear when called. "She's coming for us and y'all know it as well as I do." Misty shook her head, not wanting to think about Mrs. Hernshaw. It hurt her to see Travis in so much pain. But more than that, she was scared that he was right. Nothing had felt the same since last night. "We can't jump to conclusions," Chris told him, doing his best to sound calm. But both his best friend and his sister could see through his facade. He was just as scared as they were. "Really?" Travis asked angrily. "Yeah, our friend drowns in his shower after we see a ghost rise from the swamp. But you're right, let's not jump to any conclusions," he told him snidely. "After all, it isn't like any of us could be next." "Oh wait. That's exactly what's going to happen. That thing is going to come and pick us off one by one, just like the stories. By next week, we'll all have had accidents in the shower." Misty could feel the stinging of tears as they began to cloud her eyes. "Fighting isn't going to help anything," she said firmly. "The only thing that's going to help is putting that old bitch back in her swamp," Travis said. "What else are we supposed to do? Never shower again?" "We can't go back out there," Chris replied, looking at him evenly. "And we still don't know that it's actually a ghost, but if it is, that sounds like something she would want us to do." "Why can't we?" Travis practically shouted. "You know why," Chris said back. "Because of the ghost, that you don't believe it?" "Guys, please." Misty cut in. "This isn't helping anything, and I think we should stop saying her name." They both turned to her. "Why?" Travis asked her. "Well, that's what got us into this mess in the first place. We went down there, called her name, and she came. How do we know that can't happen again now that she's free?" "Okay, stay away from water and don't say her name," Chris repeated. "For how long?" Travis asked. "We can't wait out a ghost. According to the stories, she only comes back for one reason, and that's drowning kids. She's not just going to go away." "So what's your big plan then?" Chris asked. "We need to go back out there," Travis told them, sitting back down. "And y'all both know I'm right. Maybe we can find her house, find some way to stop her there." Chris raised his arms like he was about to protest and then sighed and dropped them. "Fine. Whatever, we'll go down there tonight," he said tiredly, sinking back down into his chair. Before Travis could say anything else, there was a knock at the door. "Who's that?" Chris asked Misty, who was sitting by the window. She leaned back and looked outside. "I'm not sure, it's some girl." "Oh my God, I think that's Tabitha Noland." "Tabitha?" Travis asked, confused. "Doesn't she go to some private school or something? What's she doing here?" "I don't know, but I think we're about to find out," Chris told him as Misty got out of her chair and walked across the room to the front door. "Hello?" she asked Tabitha. It had been years since the last time Misty or anyone else their age had even spoken to Tabitha. She'd made it clear how she felt about the town and the people a long time ago. Tabitha had definitely changed a lot of the years, and boarding school had done wonders for her. Before she'd left, she'd been a wild tomboy like Misty, but now she was a full-figured beauty queen that could rival any of the cheerleaders in Beacon Hills. Her long blonde hair was in a tight French braid that seemed to accent her leather riding boots and designer clothes. Even though she was standing in her own house, Misty suddenly felt out of place and very self-conscious. "Hey Misty, long time no see," Tabitha said shyly, and then saw Chris and Travis behind her. "Do you need something?" Misty asked her, genuinely confused. "This is going to sound crazy," Tabitha began, blushing slightly and looking around. "It's okay, we've become experts in crazy lately," Chris joked. Both Travis and Misty shot him a look. Tabitha shuffled her feet for a second, then seemed to make up her mind and continued. "Did any of you guys go into the swamp with Mike the other night?" she asked them, even though she knew the answer. Chris's smile dropped, and to Misty it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "How did you know Mike went into the swamp the other night?" Travis asked her carefully. "Because of how he died," she told them as though it was obvious. "Tabitha, what are you talking about?" Chris asked her. "Don't you know how my brothers died?" Tabitha asked them. "I know one drowned and the other went missing," Misty started. "Yes," Tabitha cut her off. "They drowned, one in the bathtub, one in the swamp, even though they never found him." "Shit," Chris said, sitting down. "I told you," Travis told him. "Shut up, Travis, it was your stupid idea to go down there," Chris shot back at him. "If it wasn't for that, Mike would still be alive." "Chris," Misty shouted at her brother, unable to believe what he'd just said. Travis looked like Chris had just struck him. "I didn't see you doing anything to talk us out of it," he said back and then walked out the front door, sliding past Tabitha on his way out. "I didn't mean," Tabitha began. "It's fine. It's nothing you did, my brothers, just an idiot," Misty said heavily, doing her best to sound reassuring. Chris leaned back in the chair and fixed his eyes on the floor. Tabitha reached behind her and pulled out an old, battered journal. "This was my brother's," she told them. "My parents never threw out any of their stuff, which is a good thing. Because he wrote about how he thought he could stop her, the swamp lady. He thought that he'd found a way. That's why he went down into the swamp that night, to stop her once and for all." "So she can be stopped," Misty muttered. Tabitha smiled. "He thought so. I think that's why he went back out there the night he died. I read it myself. If you can get inside the house down there, we could send her back for good. And then she could never come back again." "We?" Chris asked her. "We," Tabitha said confidently. "She took my brothers, ruined my family. If you guys are going back down there to face her, I'm going too." "Okay," Misty told her. "Okay?" Chris asked, throwing his arms up in the air. "No, not okay. None of this is okay. We can't bring her down there, Misty. It would only jeopardize her life too." Tabitha shrugged. "I'm not asked for your permission. I'm going whether you like it or not." "I can't." "Fine." Chris huffed and stormed upstairs. "Sorry," Tabitha said again. "It's fine really, he's just having trouble wrapping his head around it. We all are." Tabitha nodded. She understood. In fact, she was just happy that people believed her for the first time. "Tonight around 10, meet us at the stop sign at the end of Travis's Street," Misty told her. Tabitha nodded her head and went down the stairs off of the porch and started heading back to her house, wondering for the first time what she'd agreed to. It was well into the afternoon when their parents arrived home from the funeral parlor. Apparently, after helping Mike's parents sort out all the details, they'd stuck around long enough to make sure that both of his parents had some prepared meals for the next couple of days. Chris was still locked in his room. He hadn't spoken to Misty since Tabitha left, though she wasn't surprised. It was okay with her. She didn't know what to say to him. There was nothing she could say that would somehow make the situation better or change what they had to do tonight. When they'd walked in the door, she'd been curled up on the red oversized love seat in the den, attempting to read a book. But mostly she'd been lost in her thoughts. Her mother hugged her and went straight into her room. The door wasn't slammed, but the sound of it being closed still seemed to echo throughout the otherwise quiet house. Her father, on the other hand, marched straight to the kitchen and fetched the bottle of cheap whiskey he kept under the sink, the one everyone in the house pretended not to know about. And then he set to work pouring himself a glass from the half-empty plastic bottle, with a heavy sigh. Misty sat on the other end of the table and watched as her father drained the first glass in one go. His face turned red and he coughed. "Damn, stuff seems to get stronger the longer it sits," he said with a small chuckle as he attempted to ease the tension. He filled a second glass and drank that one a little more slowly. "Sorry, sweetheart, it was rough on us seeing Mike like that. He was a sweet kid. We watched him grow up right alongside you guys. And the whole time we were there we couldn't help but think, what if it had been you or Chris?" he said. "Your mother almost fell apart in there. Hell, I don't think Mike's parents will ever be okay again," he told her solemnly. Misty felt like she could cry again. How could she tell her dad that it could still be one of them? That the ghost of old Mrs. Hernshaw could just as easily come for them as she came for Mike? That they were just living on borrowed time? How do you get rid of a ghost? "Dad, in the stories about Mrs. Hernshaw, was there ever any way to make her go away?" she asked him. Her dad looked up startled, then smiled. "Good on you, sweetheart, changing the subject. Still a grim one, but urban legends and fairy tales are how many people deal with loss. Now let me think," he said and drank and pulled at his facial hair. "Now that I think about it, I remember something that my grandfather told me when I was younger than you. You've got to understand the story changes. Every generation tells it differently. Hell, your generation probably has her crawling out the television like some of those movies y'all like to watch," he said with a laugh before continuing. "Anyway, my grandfather always used to tell it that if you could get her into her old house and make her look at the picture on the mantle of her children, then she'd crawl back into the swamp, overcome with shame and guilt. Or whatever murderous old ghosts feel. You've got to understand, scary stories usually had some sort of moralistic ending in his day," he told her and finished his glass, his hand straying near the bottle for a minute, as though considering having another. Shaking his head, he stood up and capped it. "Well, I better go check on your mother," he told her with a wink, patting her head on the way out. Great, Misty thought, all we have to do is show the ghost a picture in her house. If it's even still there after 100 years, she thought miserably. She hoped that Tabitha's brother's journal had a better solution than that. Because if not, then Misty had a bad feeling that their parents would be making another trip to the funeral parlor. 9. When Chris and Misty came back down the stairs, it was close to 10. They couldn't help but feel a tinge of déjà vu. This time, however, they had a good idea of what was waiting for them out there in the swamp, which led to a sense of foreboding that seemed to cling to them as they made their way to the door. Their parents had gone to bed early. In fact, they'd only come out of their room to make dinner and then went back, the door shutting heavily behind them. She didn't even want to think about how devastated they'd be if they knew. Just thinking about it hurt her heart, especially since she knew that there was a good chance none of them would make it out of the swamp tonight. Not if Mrs. Hernshaw got her way. "Watch it," Chris hissed as Misty's left foot stepped on the one squeaky step on the bottom of the stairs, sending an echo throughout the house. Misty immediately froze. Together they listened as their dad groaned from upstairs, then rolled over and went back to sleep. After a few more minutes, they continued and headed out of the house, carefully closing the front door behind them. "Hurry up," Chris called over to her. He was already nearly to the shed. Misty realized that she had stopped right in the middle of the front porch. Misty couldn't remember ever being this scared in her entire life. The thought of going back out there filled her with her dread. So did the thought of their parents waking up to the news that both of them were gone. Entering the shed, they both quickly donned the same pairs of muddy shoes they'd worn the night before. With everything going on, they had forgotten all about them, and now they were stiff and musty, crusted with dried mud and still damp with swamp water. She wanted to say something to Chris, maybe talk him out of it. But one look told her it wouldn't matter, they needed to go. It wouldn't matter if they stayed home, or went out to the swamp if they didn't stop her now. Eventually, she'd get them. He didn't say a word to her as he shouldered the backpack and handed her a flashlight. Without another word, he turned away from her and started heading down the path towards Travis's house. Misty took one last look at their house, wishing that she were back in her bed, safe under the blankets, then she turned to follow him. The moon wasn't full tonight, a fact that coupled with the overcast cloudy skies was making it harder to follow the path without the flashlights than the night before. Misty wanted to turn hers on, but didn't want anyone else in the neighborhood knowing what they're up to. With the news of Mikey's death, everyone would be extra vigilant. Walking closely together, they slowly found their way along the dark path. It was eerily silent as they made their way up the path. Even the dogs weren't barking tonight. Whenever Misty tried to walk beside him, Chris would outpace her, making it clear that he wanted to be left alone with his thoughts. "Well, that's fine by me," she said to herself, falling back to follow his lead. It wasn't like she knew what to say to him anyway. They kept waiting to hear the sounds from last night, and jumped whenever their own feet broke a twig. If Mrs. Hernshaw was real, it wasn't like she had to chase them tonight anyway. Misty figured they were coming straight to her, and she probably knew it. All she had to do was wait. "Stop it," Misty told herself. The last thing she needed was to freak herself out before they even got there. When they hit the blacktop, they slowed. Their house was far behind them now. The only sounds were that of their feet smacking off the road. Even Chris seemed to slow down as they hit the road. The anger he'd been carrying earlier when they'd set off was now replaced by raw fear. A fear that flashed across his face for an instant only to vanish. But it was there long enough for her to see it, and secretly hope that he'd turn back. Then the night could just end with them going back home and going to bed, and doing their best to forget the whole thing, something that she knew would be impossible. If they somehow survived, she knew she'd never forget, no matter how hard she tried. Misty sighed as they trudged on. She could see the stop sign up ahead, and there was a figure leaning against it, which had to be Travis. Next to him was a smaller figure. Even from far away, she looked out of place. Tabitha was standing prim and proper next to Travis, who was slouching against the signpost and clearly trying to be far from her. Travis and Tabitha stood silently over by the stop sign at the end of the road. They seemed to be just as nervous as Chris and Misty, and kept casting furtive glances all around. As the siblings approached, they clicked their flashlights on and off at them, feeling like they needed to prove that it was them. Chris gave them a sad wave as they walked up. Travis nodded to them, and Tabitha gave them a tight-lipped smile. Misty looked at her. The other girl seemed wired. She kept shifting from foot to foot, full of nervous energy. "Are you okay?" Misty asked her while Travis and Chris talked to each other. Tabitha shrugged. "I don't know," she said, biting her lip. "I used to have nightmares about her a lot, and now I'm actually out here doing this." Misty patted her on the shoulder. "It makes you strong, you know, facing your fear." "Alive and scared isn't a terrible option either," Tabitha told her jokingly. Before Misty could say something back, Chris spoke up. "Hey, look at this." They both looked over and Travis opened his back wider. When she heard the bottles clink together, Misty wasn't sure at first what she was looking at. "What?" Molotov cocktails, Travis spoke up, cutting her off. I brought lighters for everyone too. Just in case. I figured this way we either stop her according to Tabitha's brother's diary, or we burn the entire house down, you know? Yeah, Chris told him and took a lighter. Definitely won't have to worry about drowning in a bathtub if we're all in jail for arson. I don't know about this, Tabitha said warily as they shoved lighters into her and Misty's hands. It'll be fine, not like we have much more to lose anyway, Misty told her with what she hoped was a reassuring smile. She didn't believe it, though, not for a minute. But Misty figured if they got to that point it wouldn't matter anyway, because if they went down there and failed, well, she knew deep down that none of them would be leaving that swamp. Come on, every minute we waste up here is just that much longer we've got to be out there, Travis said, zipping his bag back up and throwing it over his broad shoulders. Before anyone could say anything else, Chris and Travis walked off, leaving Misty and Tabitha to catch up. Once again, they were completely alone on the walk down there. They didn't even attempt to hide this time, and simply walked straight down the road. Not a single car passed them as they made their way down to the edge of the woods that separated the swamp from the road. If they had thought the silence on the path had been eerie, it was nothing compared to the silence in the swampy forest before them. Not even the crickets were playing their usual tune tonight. It was as if the whole county knew that something was about to happen. They all stopped right there at the edge of the woods, knowing that with the next step they took there was no turning back. Whatever happened next, it had been their choice to come here tonight. Chris and Travis pushed on easily, finding the same trails they'd made running through here the other night. Misty and Tabitha followed them single file through the mud and the muck. All of them were too scared about what lay in front of them to be worried about a little mud and grime. Soon the woods fell away, and once again they stood in the middle of the clearing. The dark water of the swamp seemed more ominous than it had the night before. For a minute, Misty and the others were frozen, staring at the unmoving water and waiting to see what might rise out of its depths. I guess she's a no-show tonight, Chris joked lamely after a minute. No funny, man, Travis told him, shaking his head. Yeah, I'm perfectly fine with her not showing up, Tabitha said, making an emphasis not to say Mrs. Hernshaw's name. The longer she left them alone, the better. Which way is the house? Misty asked them. Travis and Chris looked at each other. Shit, they said in unison. Neither of them had thought about how hard it might be to try to find a dilapidated old house in the middle of a swamp. I'm sure if we look around we'll find something, Chris said lamely, turning in place with his flashlight. But everywhere the light landed, all they could see was more swamp and trees. Wait, Tabitha told them. I think my brother's journal had something in there about the house. Using her flashlight, she pulled it out of her bag and began flipping through it. After a few minutes, she said, "Aha!" and jumped back up. Find it? Misty asked her as the others all looked at the deep water behind them, just in case her exclamation woke something up. Yes, my brother said he found the path to the house by finding the old sign, she told them. So all we have to do is find a sign nailed to a tree. Oh, is that all? Chris said with an audible groan. The others ignored him and looked around, making sure that they searched close together. The last thing any of them wanted to do was split up. Found it, Chris called out, shining his flashlight halfway up a dead tree. At first, Misty didn't realize what they were looking at, then she saw it. Half rotten and covered in dead vines was an old wooden sign with one word carved across it. Hernshaw. Guess it's this way then, Misty said, motioning to what looked like a slightly cleared area ahead of them. Just as they started heading up the path that would hopefully lead them to the Hernshaw house, behind them in the swamp, loud cackling laughter erupted. 10. As one, they all turned around and from their vantage point up on the path and looked back towards the clearing. Wah? Travis started to ask as they all stared at the figure that stood near the edge of the water. It took a couple of tentative steps, laughing as it did. The sound was somewhere between a cackle and a hissing wheeze. From where they stood, Misty could make out the long tattered grayish dress that hung about the skeletal frame in tatters. Hair long dead hung about the skull in clumps, but the worst part was the specter's eyes, empty twin sockets that seemed filled with an eerie, unnatural light. But she could feel her looking at them as their hearts hammered in their chests. The figure down the hill raised one of its skeletal hands and pointed towards the water. Its finger outstretched menacingly. Mrs. Hernshaw's message was obvious. She wanted them to join her in the swamp. Chris took a step back, a stick snapped under the weight of his back foot. The sound echoing around them down the hill as Mrs. Hernshaw's arm dropped to her side, she took a small step towards them. That's when everyone started running. The laughter stopped and was followed by what sounded like wet sticks being smacked together, or old bones running towards them, Misty thought, refusing to turn around as she took off running. The others did the same, their sneakers smacking off of the swampy ground, and behind that sound was that of Mrs. Hernshaw coming after them. Tabitha reached out and grabbed her hand, and together they ran, doing their best not to be split up. The surrounding woods were thick, and it took all their concentration to stay together. Mud pulled at their shoes and sticks and branches blocked their path, causing them to dodge out of the way and take alternative routes which led them further into the swamp, and farther from the safety of the road. As the foliage got thicker, it felt to Misty like the swamp itself wanted to hold them in place so the ghost could catch them. With every step they took, it sounded like Mrs. Hernshaw was just getting closer. They did their best to stick to the path, but the flashlight started flickering on and off, and it became harder and harder to see the trail in front of them. Suddenly, Tabitha's hand let go as they both shot around a large tree. Misty reached out, but this time it didn't come back. She stopped for a minute to look around, hoping to catch sight of the other girl, only to see something shambling up the path towards her. Something that was wearing an old tattered dress. "I'm sorry," Misty shouted out, hoping that Tabitha would hear her and understand as she ran away. Misty's heart was pounding in her chest and tears flowed freely down her cheeks. She'd seen it, she'd actually seen Mrs. Hernshaw up close, and now she was after her. Travis was right, she came for them one by one, and now Misty was alone in fair game. Misty ran as fast as she could, not stopping even as the branches scratched and tugged at her. Fetid swamp water squished out of her sneakers with every step, and she ran through more cobwebs than she wanted to think about, but Misty did not stop running. She didn't care about blisters or spiders, she just wanted to make it out of here alive. She'd worry about everything else later if she made it out alive. Up ahead, the path ended, and there, covered in dead vines and looking like it might fall in at any second, was an old house. Her house. Misty reminded herself as she gazed up at the old farmhouse in the middle of the swamp. The upstairs windows were broken out, but it looked like curtains hung in them. A sudden icy breeze blew, and they shifted slightly, just enough to make her wonder if someone was up there looking out at her. Moss vines and other plants had reclaimed much of the walls. Yet surprisingly, the front door was still there. It was closed, and Misty was willing to bet, probably stuck in place by the summer humidity. Misty looked around but didn't see the others. She didn't want to go into that creepy old house, not alone. Besides, they'd need Tabitha's brother's notes if they were going to stop Mrs. Hernshaw. Off to the side of the house was a small wooden shed. It looked no more stable than the house, but at least she could hide there for a little while. Even though she didn't like the idea of hiding in a confined space, Misty kept reminding herself that it would only be until she heard the others. Misty prayed that the rest of them would make it out of the woods before Mrs. Hernshaw got them. Occasionally she could still hear Mrs. Hernshaw back the way she came, walking around searching for them. Misty gulped as fresh tears came to her eyes. She hoped Tabitha was okay. She felt terrible about leaving her behind, but the other girl would understand. Tabitha knew better than all of them what Mrs. Hernshaw was capable of. Making up her mind, Misty headed towards the shed, praying she wasn't about to make a fatal mistake. She made it quickly across the overgrown yard and over to the shed. The rusty hinges squeaked loudly as she opened the door, and Misty jumped at the sound. She turned her flashlight on to look inside and immediately wished she hadn't. The floorboards were rotted out, and it looked like the place had been home to various snakes and rodents over the years and still might be. The walls and ceilings were thick with spiderwebs that gleamed in the light. Steeling herself, Misty took one last look behind her before stepping inside and turning off the flashlight. Shutting the door, she then tried to get as many of the spider webs off of her as possible. Wishing she'd had the forethought to bring a stick, but if it was between spiders or a murderous ghost, she'd take spiders any day. Misty stopped moving around and held her breath. Outside, she could hear someone moving around in the yard. They were walking slowly as though they were looking for something, and she feared that Mrs. Earnshaw had found her. Misty put her hands over her mouth to stifle her breathing, terrified that it might give her away. She listened as the footsteps came closer and closer. For a minute she thought about calling out, trying to tell herself that it could be her brother or one of her friends. But she knew better than to do that. If it was them, wouldn't they have called out already? The footsteps stopped in front of her as the door began slowly opening. The rusty hinges squeaking loudly as the door opened all the way, revealing her hiding spot to whatever was waiting on the other side. That's when Misty started to scream. 11. Tabitha was running as fast as she could. Years of running track and jogging at boarding school were finally paying off. She was gripping Misty's hand for dear life and practically pulling the other girl behind her. She was terrified of them losing each other in the swamp. That's what Mrs. Earnshaw wanted them to do, so she could pick them all off one at a time. Just like she had her brother and his friends. Suddenly her left foot snagged a root, and she went head over heels down into the muddy undergrowth. For a second she lay there dazed. As she stumbled back to her feet, she looked around for Misty. At first she thought she was seeing things, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw Misty walking back to the tree and then freeze. She struggled to make out what the other girl was looking at in the distance. For a second she thought about calling out, but then she saw what held Misty's attention. Tabitha froze on the spot. She didn't blame Misty for taking off in the opposite direction. In fact, if she could have pulled herself out of the murk fast enough and gotten back onto the path, she'd have done the same thing. Instead, she crouched down and watched as the corpse-like spirit of Mrs. Earnshaw shambled up the path towards Misty. And for a second, she was shamefully happy that it wasn't coming after her. As Mrs. Earnshaw shambled past, Tabitha had to suppress a scream. She could see everything. Every horrid inch of her waterlogged bloated flesh, the yellowed old bones, but the worst was her face. Skeletal and framed with what was left of her hair, the eyes lit by an unnatural glow. Tabitha didn't make a sound, her hands covering her mouth as Mrs. Earnshaw went past her, the long tattered dress trailing behind her without a sound. She waited there in the mud until the only thing left of Mrs. Earnshaw was the scent of swamp and rotten flesh. Only then did she carefully walk back up to the path. She looked both ways just to make sure that Mrs. Earnshaw was gone. Even though they hadn't really talked in years, she hoped Misty was okay. No one deserved to die by the Mrs. Earnshaw's icy hands. For a minute, she thought about turning around and going back home. After all, she'd already told them what they needed to do to stop the monster. Her brother hadn't finished it, but they now knew all that she did. She didn't call the name, it wasn't her that the spirit was after. Tabitha could still go home, wash off the mud, and pretend this whole thing was a bad dream. Then she could wait to get sent back to boarding school. Maybe if she threw enough of a fit, they'd even send her out to her grandparents' house. But that's not what her brothers would have done. Both of them had come out here to face Mrs. Earnshaw and tried to end her evil once and for all. Even though it had cost them everything, they'd at least tried, she sighed. She couldn't turn back now. She needed to find the others. They never should have run like that in the first place. Separating them from each other was exactly what Mrs. Earnshaw had wanted. And it's exactly what she'd gotten. She hoped that Travis and Chris were still together. Taking a deep breath to calm her nerves, she slowly headed down the path towards Misty and towards the house, hoping to find the other girl before Mrs. Earnshaw did. She could no longer hear or see the ghost or whatever Mrs. Earnshaw was. Tabitha didn't know if that was a good thing or not. For all she knew, Mrs. Earnshaw could be there hiding in the dark waiting to pull her into the swamp when she least expected it. Tabitha shivered and tried not to think about it. She'd already decided. She would not leave Misty behind. Not again. She didn't have to go far before walking up to the house. It was just as creepy as she'd expected it to be. Finally flicking her flashlight back on, she looks around the grounds. For a moment she thought about walking into the house, but just being near it, the air seemed to be 10 degrees colder. She shivered and could see her breath, something that should be impossible on a humid summer night like tonight. Looking around, she decided that there was no way that Misty had gone into the house. Not alone. That's when she spotted the shed. It was on the edge of the property near the house. Though it was tough to tell where the woody swamp ended and the yard began. The shed looked like it had seen better days. It was nothing more than a shack made of rotten boards and a sagging rusty metal roof. She felt like someone was watching her. Turning her flashlight off, Tabitha flipped it over and crept up ready to use it like a baton. As she got closer for a moment, she would have sworn that she could hear someone breathing inside of it. Carefully she pulled on the door, pulling it open, her flashlight held high, ready to bring it crashing down on anything that might jump out at her. The door squeaked open slowly. Tabitha's heart pounded in her chest. As it opened wide enough for her to see inside, she sighed in relief. Standing there in the shed was just Misty, then the other girl pointed behind her and starting screaming. That's when Tabitha felt bony hands dig into her shoulders. 12. Chris and Travis had lost sight of the girls. When they'd seen the figure of Mrs. Hernshaw coming towards them, it had been too much, and before they knew it, they were well off the path and in the middle of the densely wooded swamp. "We're getting lost, man," Chris said, coming to a stop and feeling more than a little guilty about leaving his sister and Tabitha behind. Once they had all started running, he'd assumed they were following. Now he just hoped they were okay. "You can't stop running," Travis said, still ahead of him. "If we stop, she'll come and get us and drown us just like she did to Mike, man." "Dude, we can't leave everyone behind. The only way we can stop this is to work together, and you know that. She's trying to get us all alone. That way it will be easier for her." Chris shouted at him. "We need to go back and find the path. That way we can find the others." Travis stared at him, his hands over his head, panting. Chris's heart sank. He knew what was coming, but he couldn't believe it. "I can't, man. I'm getting thee out of here and going back home where it's safe. I'll keep the lights on. I can avoid water, but I can't do any of that out here. She wanted us to come out here, and we played straight into her hands." Travis whispered. "Are you serious? They need us? We can't stop this without you," Chris told him. Travis shrugged. "Y'all figure it out, but you know as well as I do there's no stopping this. It's every man for themselves now, and I will not be next." Chris just shook his head and watched solemnly as Travis disappeared back into the woods. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't terrified. Chris hated being alone after dark, and being lost in the woods and never being found was one of his greatest fears. He took a deep breath and reminded himself that would not happen. As much as he hated to admit it, Travis was right. How could they avoid water in the swamp? If they stayed out here, she'd eventually get them. Maybe this was part of Mrs. Hernshaw's plan after all, but he didn't want to think about that, not right now anyway. Right now, the only thing he cared about was finding the girls. Then they could make a new plan from there. Turning his flashlight back on, he picked his way carefully through the trees. The only sound was the squelch of his tennis shoes in the dark mud. He wished there'd been something he could have said to make Travis stay. He'd have given anything to not have to run back to the path on his own, and now that both of them were alone, Mrs. Hernshaw could pick either of them as her next victim. Jumping every time one of his feet snapped a twig or splashed in a puddle, Chris's nerves couldn't take much more. If he didn't find the path soon, he'd die of a heart attack before Mrs. Hernshaw could find him. Part of him now felt guilty for letting Travis leave by himself, but he knew that when Travis made up his mind, that was it, out of all of them, though he'd never thought that Travis would have been the one to abandon them. And no matter how much Misty got under his skin sometimes, Chris would never abandon his sister. All thoughts of Travis left his mind, however, as he burst back onto the path. Thankful that he'd finally found it. He just started walking up it when he heard the screaming begin. Chris ran as fast as he could, recognizing the voice as his sister's. He would not let her face the ghost of Mrs. Hernshaw alone. Soon another voice joined in at first. He couldn't place it. "Tabitha." He realized after a moment, but didn't want to think about what could cause them both to scream like that. The path ended in an opening, and there in front of him was the house, but he didn't have time to stop and look at it because he could clearly see why the girls were screaming. Tabitha was getting pulled backward by something straight out of Chris's worst nightmare. It was a walking corpse, not some kind of flickering gray spectral entity like he'd expected. Mrs. Hernshaw, in all her glory, was way worse up close than Chris could have ever imagined. As he got closer, he could see the bones and rotten skin, but the worst part was the smell. A putrid, musty odor that seemed to cloy to the inside of his nose. It was like rotten flesh and dried swamp mud. Misty held tightly onto Tabitha as Mrs. Hernshaw pulled them both back away from the dilapidated shed and closer to the house. Without thinking, Chris charged forward, lowering his shoulder down just like he did on the football field with Travis. He half expected to go through her, or for her to break apart like a cartoon skeleton. Instead, it felt like hitting a brick wall as they both tumbled to the ground. His right shoulder and arm were numb and tingling in a throbbing way that made him feel quite confident that something had fractured or was close to it. Stunned, he lay on the cold ground, looking up. The trees were so thick he couldn't even see the stars. Before he could climb back up to his feet, he found himself staring into the cold, cruel eyes of Mrs. Hernshaw. Her milky white orbs seemed to glow as they peered down into his own clear blue ones. Chris wanted to roll over and run away, but his shoulder hurt too badly for that. Before he could do anything, though, her skeletal hands wrapped themselves around his ankles and pulled him in the same direction that she'd been trying to pull Tabitha. This time, though, she moved a lot faster. Misty and Tabitha tried to jump and grab his hands, but they were too late as Mrs. Hernshaw dragged Chris backward over the rough ground. He grabbed out but couldn't find anything to hold on to as small sticks, stones, and other things dug into his head, face, and any other parts of him not protected by his clothes. The back of his head bounced roughly off the old wooden stairs and against the bottom of the doorway as she pulled him into the house, dazing him for a moment. He grabbed the doorway and tried to get away, but she pulled hard on his legs, so hard he expected them to pop out of their sockets. Just as he thought his strength was about to fail him, two more sets of hands wrapped around him. Tabitha and Misty looped their arms around his arms and shoulders and pulled with all their might. Mrs. Hernshaw looked at them and then seemed to look away as though she heard something. Her mouth split into an evil grin showing long, rotten teeth, and then she let go of him. Chris dropped back to the wooden floor of the house and the girls fell backward. He could only watch in horror as Mrs. Hernshaw seemed to step back into the darkness of the house and completely disappear. He lay there panting for a moment as he struggled to catch his breath. When he finally did, the pain in his arms and the rest of his body slammed into him. Chris didn't want to move. "Where did she go?" Tabitha asked, looking around as Misty and her came inside the old house and helped him to stand back up. Something that took more effort than he would have liked. Feeling his shoulder, he winced but didn't think it was too serious. But knew that he'd have one heck of a bruise there tomorrow. "She went after an easier victim," Chris told them sullenly. Not wanting to meet Misty's eyes. Knowing a little of how she felt about his best friend. It had been impossible to ignore the looks they gave each other when they thought he wasn't paying attention. "What do you mean?" Misty asked him, looking around for the first time and realizing that someone was missing. "Wait a minute. Where's Travis?" she asked him. "There's nothing we can do," he told her sadly. "Bullshit," Misty shot back. "Chris, where's Travis?" "Misty, calm down," Tabitha said, putting a hand on her shoulder before she could get in Chris's face. Chris looked at the floor. "I'm sorry, Misty. I tried to stop him but he ran. I've never seen him like that." "So what?" "He's out there alone. We've got to save him," she demanded. But Tabitha shook her head. "You know we'll never make it to him in time. The best way to help him is to go through the house and stop Mrs. Hernshaw once and for all." "So we just leave him?" Misty said, tears stealing down her face. Chris sighed. He didn't want to look at her, then he might start crying too. Travis was his oldest friend. They'd been inseparable since they were in preschool, and now he was pretty sure he'd never see him again. He made his choice, Chris said solemnly before turning and following Tabitha deeper into the house. 13. Travis ran as fast as he could. Years of playing sports were finally paying off as he tore through the swamp and headed to what he hoped was the road. Already he could see a break in the trees, which meant he was almost out and that much closer to home. He felt guilty about leaving Chris and ditching the girls. He knew the look of disappointment on Chris's face would haunt him for the rest of his life. But as long as he survived, he could always make it up to him. Going back into the swamp had been a mistake. He knew that now. They couldn't stop her. How could they stop something like that? Something that's already dead? Travis knew that whatever Tabitha had planned was doomed to fail. It hadn't worked for her brothers, so why would it work for them? No, the best thing they could do is hold up in their houses and avoid water. Or do what Tabitha did, and leave Beacon Hills altogether. He let out a whoop of joy as he crashed through the trees and his feet thudded onto the blacktop. Luckily for him, there weren't any cars coming because he didn't look before he leapt out of the swamp and onto the hard pavement. Looking around, he realized he was a little further up the road from where they'd gone in the woods. Which was fine because it put him that closer to the safety of his home. Before heading on, he waited there for a minute, hoping that Chris had been smart enough to bail too. But he didn't hear anyone else crashing around. It looked like he was the only one that made it out. Hopefully he'd hear from them tomorrow morning. Even if it was just so they could call him an asshole. Travis was fine with that as long as they were okay. That's all that mattered. Travis was a survivor. Friends or no friends, he wasn't going to wait around for some undead bitch to take him out. Going back into the woods was a mistake, he thought again. They should have waited and tried to lure her out. Then they could have set a trap, played the whole thing differently. Smarter. As he started walking up the road, he heard the clink of the Molotov cocktails he'd made in his backpack, and could only think about how foolish the others had been. His big dangerous weapons, and he didn't even know if they worked, he'd gotten the instructions off the internet. If he hadn't been so terrified of getting caught, he would have tested a few first. Made sure they actually burned like they were supposed to. He just hoped Misty would forgive him. If she survived, of course, he liked her a lot, but no one was worth dying for. Especially not against something like that. He hoped that with time she'd understand why he'd left. Suddenly he heard a crash off to the left coming from the swamp. The sound was unmistakable, someone was moving around out there. But whoever they were, he couldn't see them. "Chris?" he called out, not giving a damn who heard him. At this point he could give two shits if he got in trouble for sneaking out. At least if he was grounded, he'd still be alive. There was no answer, but whatever it was moving around was coming closer. The bushes shook as something or someone pushed their way through them. Hell with this, Travis swore and continued up the road, this time at a sprint. The sooner he could put the swamp in his rear view, the better. The stop sign was just up ahead that marked the entrance to his street. The street was entirely dark. It looked like not a single person was up this time of night, which wasn't exactly surprising around here, Travis thought. Even so, it made him uneasy, and even more alone as he made his way up the street. He'd have liked it better if someone was awake. That way, even if they were yelling at him, he wouldn't be alone. Slowing down, he took a moment to look behind, and immediately wished he hadn't. Charging up the street behind him in an all-out run was Mrs. Hernshaw. Her eerily glowing eyes locked on him as she ran towards him, her skeletal feet clacking off of the pavement with every step. Travis took off. He poured on every ounce of speed that he could manage as he tore down the street. As he took the turn at the stop sign, he looked over and was shocked to see that the street behind him was now empty. But that was impossible. He knew what he'd seen. He'd seen her coming right towards him. Instead of slowing down, he kept up the pace. He could see his house from here, and was ready to put this night behind him once and for all. Just as he was about to turn into his house, a figure stepped out of the darkness and came towards him. Travis spun and took off. Mrs. Hernshaw hissed and chased him. Trying to put as much distance as possible between them, he ran into the yard across the street and hopped the fence. Too bad he didn't stick the landing. Travis hit the ground hard and rolled his ankle on the way down. He lay there on his back, momentarily stunned. before ambling to his feet. The yard was empty, besides an old doghouse with a flipped-over water dish next to it. Travis knew the Roberts dog had passed away 8 years earlier, and that he wouldn't have anything to worry about on that end. As he stood up, he grunted in pain. His ankle was already swelling and it hurt like hell. Shit. Travis thought, taking a tentative step. There was no way he was going to be able to run on it. Opening his backpack, he swore again. One of his makeshift Molotovs had broken and his backpack was now filled with kerosene, the smell of which was overwhelming. The other, thankfully, was completely intact. He took it out and dried the fuel off it the best that he could. The last thing he wanted to do when lighting it was accidentally set himself on fire. Good deal, he said out loud, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the lighter that he'd grabbed out of his mother's purse earlier. There was still no sign of Mrs. Earnshaw. There was a gate at the back of the yard, which was unlocked. Most people didn't lock anything around here. Taking one tentative step after the other, he made his way over there, grunting in pain each time he put pressure on his left foot. As he walked past the doghouse with the crooked red letters that said Rufus on top of it, he kept his eyes peeled at the back gate, waiting to see if Mrs. Earnshaw was waiting for him on the other side. Feeling something latch onto his left leg, Travis shrieked as he toppled over. There, coming out of the darkness of the doghouse, was a skeletal arm, its hand curled around his leg and pulling him towards the darkness. He kicked it away and crawled backward. Another arm shot of the dark house, and Mrs. Earnshaw dragged herself out of the gloom. It sounded like she chuckled as she pulled herself free of the old doghouse. Her laugh, if it was a laugh, sounded more like a tea kettle going off deep underwater. "Get away from me!" Travis shouted again at her as crawled backward, reaching for the Molotov cocktail that had rolled out of his grasp as he fell. Mrs. Earnshaw seemed like she wasn't in a rush as she slowly ambled up to her feet. She walked towards him, arms outstretched towards him like a zombie in a bad monster movie. He couldn't believe it. After everything that he'd done, Travis refused to die this way. Not if he could help it. As she came towards him, he rolled over to his side, groaning as he used his left foot to propel himself. Just as she grabbed hold of his legs and started dragging him back, his hand wrapped around the cool glass bottle of the Molotov cocktail. She pulled him back towards the rear of the yard, towards what seemed like a tiny koi pond. He hadn't known that the Roberts were even into that stuff, or he never would have jumped the fence into their yard. The last thing he wanted was to be near water. Even stranger to him, though, was the fact that as much noise as they'd been making, not a single light had come on in the house, or the rest of the street for that matter. As he was pulled closer to the koi pond, Travis flicked the lighter twice and then lit the old rag at the top of the bottle. He knew he was going to have some explaining to do, but didn't care. He kicked out and miraculously broke away from her grip. Mrs. Earnshaw seemed to snarl as her rotten mouth opened menacingly, giving him a full view of her gnarled blackened teeth as she turned to grab him again. Travis threw the bottle as hard as he could, and smiled at the look of what he felt was surprise on the dead thing's face as the bottle broke and she was suddenly engulfed in flames. He watched in horror as the flaming figure of Mrs. Earnshaw walked towards him with her arms outstretched. "No, no, no," he gasped, crawling backward as the flaming cadaver took several more steps before collapsing onto the ground. Slowly the fire died down, and after a puff of thick black smoke there was absolutely nothing left, just a charred silhouette in the grass. Travis stared at the blackened spot in the Roberts' otherwise pristine backyard, and couldn't believe it. He'd done it. He'd stopped Mrs. Earnshaw once and for all. Now Chris and the others would have to forgive him for running off and leaving them. Of course, that would be after he explained what had just happened to the rest of the neighborhood. In pain, he pulled himself back to his feet and walked over to the side of the koi pond. There he sat down on one of the big garden boulders and waited for one of the Roberts to come outside and ask just what the hell was going on. He figured there was no point trying to run. He wouldn't get far on his messed up ankle anyway. And he knew the Roberts, they'd been his neighbors for as long as he could remember. He'd just tell them it was a firework or something. Of course, he'd probably have to come back and do some landscaping for them, and probably cut their grass the rest of the summer. But Travis figured that was a small price to pay. He kept staring at the spot on the ground and smiling. He'd done it. He'd really done it. Now Travis had become what he'd always imagined he would one day be. A hero. A real God's honest hero. Wait until Misty heard about this. Then she'd have to forgive him. He sat there for a couple more minutes, just catching his breath when he realized that something was wrong. There were still no lights in the house. Not a single person seemed to have woken up, even though a literal Molotov had exploded across their backyard. "What's?" He just started saying out loud when there was a loud splash behind him. Before he could jump forward, the steely grip of Mrs. Hernshaw's dead hands wrapped around him and pulled him back into the koi pond. He could feel the fish splashing all around his face as water rushed into his mouth and nose. His hands and feet flung uselessly in the air as he struggled to free himself, to no avail. In the otherwise grimy pool water, Travis couldn't see anything around him, but he could feel Mrs. Hernshaw as she dragged him down closer to her, closer to the bottom, and then as Travis's entire world faded to black, he swore that a light turned on in the Roberts kitchen. Too bad they wouldn't be in time to save him. 14. "We should get out of here while we still can," Chris said as he got to his feet. Misty had turned her flashlight on, and between the three of them they could see clearly inside the house. It seemed to be empty, but they knew looks could be deceiving. No one else spoke as they all looked around. Chris desperately wanted to leave. He couldn't help but think that Travis had the right idea. The place was covered in thick cobwebs and smelled like brackish water and mildew. Though it seemed like all the furniture was still there, and unlike the movies he'd grown up watching, no one seemed to have thought to cover any of it in white sheets. Instead, they left it all exactly where it was, letting it slowly rot into the floor. Most of the couches and chairs seemed so rotten that plants and other things were growing out of them. He wondered what else might live in the house. Without thinking, he brushed himself off, unable to shake the feeling that insects might be crawling around on his clothes. In the next room, they found what appeared to be the dining room. There was a large round table sat on its side. Rusty tablespoons and forks sat clattered around it, as though it had toppled over in the middle of a meal. Or perhaps flung by a father desperately looking for his murdered children. Chris repressed a shudder and forced himself to turn away. "Guys, we should really..." Chris started again, hoping to talk sense into the others. Tabitha cut him off. "I know you want to leave, but if we don't stop her now, we never will. All we have to do is find that damn painting, and then we can get rid of her once and for all." "How do we know that will work?" Misty asked her. "We don't," Tabitha told her honestly, knowing that it would do little to reassure either of them but didn't want to lie. "But it's the best chance we have and the only lead we have to follow." They looked around, searching the first floor. It was terrifying. Chris thought every one of their steps made a loud creak from the rotten wooden boards. Ones that seemed to echo throughout the house. They found several pictures along the wall, mildewed and covered in thick layers of dust. No paintings though, just black and white pictures, so weathered that they couldn't even make out the people in them. The kitchen was the same way. Old pots and pans were strewn haphazardly across the room, along with plates and other dishes. What animals hadn't gotten into, Mother Nature and time had. Several of the cabinets had collapsed and spilled their contents across the floor. "I doubt there's going to be any pictures in here," Chris muttered as they looked around. He was right, but they still looked anyway, just in case. Misty finally said out loud what they'd all been dreading. "We need to check upstairs." The others turned and looked at her. The last thing Chris wanted to do was go upstairs. At least now they were still close to the front door, they could make a run for it. Up there, Mrs. Hernshaw could corner them on the stairs and trap them in the house. "That's a really dumb idea," Chris finally replied, leading the way as they walked back into the main room of the house. Chris stopped in front of the staircase. "We'll end up falling through them before any of us make it to the top," he told them, pointing at the old, rotted stairs. "I'm going up," Tabitha said solemnly, not looking at the others. "Me too," Misty added. Chris reached out to grab her hand but then seemed to think better of it, as he watched Tabitha and his sister slowly head up the stairs. The entire house seemed to creak and groan as they made their way upstairs. Misty held her breath most of the way since every step she took made the stairs sag and bend. At the bottom of the stairs, Chris waited for one of them to fall through, not knowing what he would do if they did. Miraculously, they made it to the top of the stairs. Misty looked back down the stairs and smiled at him as Tabitha searched around upstairs with her flashlight. "Are you coming?" Misty asked him. He looked at the stairs and shook his head. "There's no point in all of us going up there. If you find something, I'll come up, but I don't think that the stairs will hold my weight." "You aren't that big," Tabitha chimed in unhelpfully. "Bigger than you," Chris shot back. Misty sighed. "Fine, but don't you think it's dumb to split up? We know that she, who probably shouldn't be named, likes to go after people who are alone. I'll only be down here, besides it's not like y'all won't come running if she shows up," he told them. Tabitha and Misty looked at each other. "Fine, but don't move. I don't want to lose you too." "I know," he said sadly. Misty gave him one last fleeting look before turning after Tabitha to help her search the upstairs. From where he stood, he could hear them stomping around, going from room to room. "Nothing in here," Tabitha shouted out, and he could hear her. They turned to look somewhere else. Dash 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 dash. Misty exited the room on Tabitha's heels. The upstairs was creepier than the downstairs. In the first room they went into, they found children's toys and what had probably once been clothes strewn about everywhere. What had really creeped her out was the empty child-sized beds. There were two other rooms up at the top of the stairs. One with the door closed, the other looked like it was probably just a closet. Together, they headed down the small hallway towards the other bedroom. A sense of dread filled her as they walked down the hall and away from the stairs. Chris was alone down there, and worse now, he was out of sight. If anything happened to her brother, Misty would never forgive herself. Why hadn't the stubborn idiot just come upstairs with them? She couldn't help but think angrily, even though she knew the answer. Her brother was close to his breaking point. She knew that Travis leaving had been too much, and if they didn't figure this out soon, she didn't think he'd leave her, but Misty didn't want to put it to the test. Seeing that Mrs. Hernshaw drag him inside the house was almost enough to make her want to run off too. That they hadn't seen Mrs. Hernshaw in a while made her nervous too. She could help but wonder where she was. Was she waiting for them in one of the rooms? Or was she after Travis now? And if so, how much time would that buy them? She thought, more than a little guilty. She tried to stop thinking about it as they got to the door. Thinking about Travis hurt too much right now. If he was still alive, she wasn't sure how to forgive him, or even if she could. Door shut tight. Tabitha groaned and pressed up against it with all her might. The thing didn't budge. The summer humidity must have swelled it in the frame. That, and the fact that it didn't look like this door had been opened in a long time. Misty pushed on the door, testing it. The thing barely budged. They'd have to ram it if they wanted it to open. Standing up on her tippy toes, Misty tested the floor under their feet and was happy to find that it was holding firm. Last thing any of them need tonight was to fall from the second story. "On the count of 3? Misty asked her, a grim smile on her face. She'd always kind of wanted to kick down a door. Tabitha nodded. 1, 2, 3. She yelled, and they charged, throwing their shoulders low just like the heroes in the movies did. When their weight hit the door, it blew out of the frame and sent them to the floor in a cloud of dust. "What was that?" Chris yelled from downstairs. Misty lay on her back next to Tabitha. Both girls coughed about in the dust and tried to ignore the aching pain in their shoulders. "Nothing, just getting the door," Misty yelled back to him. "That's one way of putting it," Tabitha replied and climbed to her feet. Then dusted herself off. She pulled her flashlight back out of her back pocket and looked around the room. Slowly, Misty joined her. They were in what had to be Mrs. Hernshaw's old room. She'd expected it to be scary, like something out of a horror movie, with dolls' heads nailed to the wall and demonic writing on the floor, but it wasn't. In fact, under all the dust, grime, and decay, it probably looked a lot more like someone's grandmother's room. A large bed, dresser, and small makeup table with a grime-covered mirror sat in the corner. Just like in the other room, there wasn't any sign of any sort of pictures. It looked like they'd hit another dead end. Maybe it's in that trunk? Tabitha asked, shining her light over to the other side of the bed where in the shadows, and almost out of sight against the wall, was an antique trunk. How could it be in there? Misty asked her dubiously. Tabitha shrugged. You can roll up canvas. Maybe it got taken out of the frame and someone put it in there? Who would do that? Misty asked her. Tabitha stamped her foot. I don't know. Maybe she couldn't stand the sight of them after her crime either. We don't have any other choice, do we? Maybe the picture doesn't exist. Maybe your brother was wrong, she said with more venom in her voice than she'd intended. Tabitha bit her bottom lip and looked like she wanted to say something. Instead, she just shrugged and went over to the trunk and grabbed a handle. Are you going to help me with this, or not? Instead of replying, Misty simply went over there and grabbed one of the handles. God, this thing is heavy, she commented as they dragged it across the floor. Which means it's in here, Tabitha replied confidently. Maybe either way, something is definitely in here. Misty threw gritted teeth. There was no way they'd be able to get this down the stairs alone. Chris, we need your help, Misty shouted down the hallway. They heard the unmistakable sound of someone running up the stairs. Then suddenly, Chris looked up at them as they rounded the corner. Did you find it? He asked, looking at the trunk they dragged to the edge of the stairs. Maybe, Tabitha replied, giving Misty a look. Just let it slide down, he told them. For heaven's sake, just help us, Chris, Misty retorted angrily. Her brother looked around for a moment, making sure the staircase was truly empty before climbing down. He stopped about midway so that he could help guide the chest down. Happy now? He asked her about the stairs, holding his weight as he grabbed one end of the trunk and they took it down. I don't know what the big deal is. See how easy this is? Chris asked them, giving a cocky smile, one that froze onto his face as the stairs under his feet gave out. Misty didn't even realize what had happened at first. One minute her brother was right there in front of them, and then he was gone down into the darkness below. The trunk slid forward and fell into the hole. The momentum of the chest had also pulled Tabitha forward, but she leapt clear of the hole only to crash in a heap at the bottom of the stairs. Misty threw herself backward and landed hard on her back at the top of the stairs. When she opened her eyes, she saw the ghastly figure of Mrs. Earnshaw crawling out of her bedroom and coming right towards her. Then there was screaming. She wasn't sure if it was hers or Tabitha's, as the animated corpse made its way towards them. 15. Chris had known something bad would happen if he stepped on the stairs, but he'd still done it anyway. When he felt it collapse under him, he'd been terrified, more so because deep down he'd known something like this would happen. His fall was brief, but instead of crashing into a concrete floor below like he thought, he splashed down into chest-high water. Which was so much worse. Getting him in the water was exactly what that monster wanted. Everything was pitch black. He pulled himself up above the water and gasped for air, wishing that he'd fell onto concrete instead. A broken leg would be better than water with Mrs. Earnshaw after them. He needed to get out of here quick. The basement he now found himself in stank. It smelled like stagnant water and decay and growing things. It was clear what had happened over the years. The swamp had slowly reclaimed the basement. He just hoped nothing else had reclaimed it. The last thing he wanted to worry about right now was snakes on top of everything else. He almost gagged at the stench of the place as he plunged his hands into his pockets, looking for the little flashlight he'd brought as a backup. Switching it back on, he blinked as light filled the room. Steadying his breath, he looked around, trying to find the staircase. It was over on the other side of the completely flooded basement. He waded through the water, trying not to think about what might lurk down below. Chris could feel things bump his leg under the water. Things that gave way when he pushed back. Keep your head in the game, he told himself as he came to the staircase. Shining his flashlight up the stairs where he could see the door. It was small, more like a closet door than a basement. He couldn't think of where it led out to. They'd walked through the house earlier and had seen nothing that looked like a basement door, not that he would have volunteered to go down there if they had. He flashed his light back to the other end of the room, where the trunk had splashed down after him. Luckily, he'd avoided being hit with it because, unlike him, it hadn't resurfaced. Chris thought about going after it, then he heard Misty's blood-curdling shriek from upstairs and decided against it. They could come back for it later. Right now, his sister needed him. One at a time, he carefully tested his weight on the slick basement stairs and headed up. One hand on the rotten algae-covered stair rail and the other clutching tightly to his flashlight. He was halfway up when the first stair gave beneath his feet. Chris was plunged forward. This time he snagged some of the other stairs higher up as his flashlight splashed down into the dark water below. Slowly he pulled himself onto the stairs. The door was so close he could touch it, but then more of the steps gave out too, and Chris dropped into the water for a second time. For a minute he wasn't able to breathe, finally found his way back up. Several broken stairs floated around him. He fished around and came up with his flashlight, which was miraculously still working. Shining it around, he found that his hopes for another exit quickly dashed. The only way out was up. Unless Misty and Tabitha came to his rescue, it looked like he was royally screwed. The only way he was getting out of here was if he could make it out the door above him. And unless Chris miraculously grew wings all of a sudden, he couldn't think of another way out. Looking around, he remembered the trunk, or at least the area where it had gone down. If he could get over to it, then he'd be able to use it to prop himself up, and maybe then he could jump up and grab the ledge. The ledge was better reinforced than the stairs, and if he could grab onto it, then there was a good chance he could pull himself up. That or he'd wind up just breaking his neck. Which still might be better than what would happen if he waited for Mrs. Earnshaw to join him down here. With all this water, he wouldn't have a chance in hell against her. Making his mind up, he headed over to where the chest sat just below the water. Just as he was heading over there, something bumped into his leg. He went to push it away, thinking that it was one of the boards from the stairs, but instead of hitting wood, his hands tangled in a bunch of hair. "What the?" he said, and recoiled back as a pale body floated up to the surface. Chris couldn't believe what he was seeing, but this body wasn't Mrs. Earnshaw. It couldn't be he'd seen her face to face, and for one thing, this one still had too much flesh on it. With a tentative hand, he reached out and rolled it over. When he saw the face, Chris stumbled backward, unable to believe what he was seeing. "Ah," he moaned, stumbling away from the bloated corpse of his friend Mike. "Hey, Chris." Mike rasped, his glassy eyes looking right at him. "Am I Ike?" Chris started. "I'm so cold, buddy, Sue. Cold I can't move." Mike continued. "It was nice of you to come to visit though, Chris." "No, this isn't real," Chris said back, moving away from Mike's body and towards the chest, knowing that was his only real chance of escape. As he flashed the light around, he could see more bodies popping up all around them. He waded through them towards the chest. "You can't fight it." Mike's cold, dead voice rasped out across the room. "He's right." Travis's voice cut in. "You'll like it in the swamp, Chris, Mrs. Earnshaw. She'll take good care of us, you'll see." That stopped Chris cold. "Travis?" he asked, spinning the flashlight around the room, unable to see his friend. "I'm here, Chris." "It's okay," Travis's voice said again. "I know the truth now. I shouldn't have left you in the woods, but it wouldn't have mattered anyway." "What are you talking about?" Chris asked, edging closer to the chest, using his hands to push the bodies through the water and out of his way. "She'll get you in the end," Travis said solemnly, his voice completely emotionless. "She always does. In the end, you can't fight her, you can't outrun her, she'll find you when you least expect it. Then you can be here with us forever, buddy." "I'm going to get through this," Chris all but shouted back to them as his foot hit the heavy ridge of the trunk. "No, you won't," Mike retorted. "But look on the bright side. At least you'll be here with us." "It's not so bad, Chris, I'm not scared of anything anymore." "Shut up," Chris shouted, willing himself to ignore them as he reached down and grabbed a side of the chest and dragged it towards the door. But before he got very far, something heavy came crashing down on him from above. "Told you." He heard Mike's voice drone as he went down under the water. Chris really hoped that his friend was wrong. 16. Misty froze after the first scream, unable to move as the horrid figure of Mrs. Hernshaw charged at her from the top of the stairs. One look at her twisted, leering face, and Misty knew that if Mrs. Hernshaw got her, it would all be over. She moved quickly, scrambling to her feet just as Mrs. Hernshaw got close enough to reach out and grab her. She went forward, hoping to leap over the hole in the stairs and get away, when Mrs. Hernshaw's iron-like grip wrapped itself around her left leg and pulled her back. "No!" Misty screamed out as she was jerked backward. Luckily, she could catch herself before she fell too hard. Mrs. Hernshaw yanked again, trying to pull her back down the hallway. Laying on her chest, Misty desperately clutched at the stairs and the wall to avoid being dragged. At the bottom of the stairs, she could see Tabitha still motionless where she fell. "Tabitha!" Misty screamed out as Mrs. Hernshaw pulled hard once again. The muscles in her arms ached as she struggled to pull herself away. This time, something in her leg groaned painfully. She kicked backward feebly and Mrs. Hernshaw yanked again. Misty did her best to keep her fingers curved around the stairs in a white-knuckled grip, but it was too much, and with a painful ripping tear she was finally pulled away. She lost several fingernails as she was dragged back down the hallway. Tears of pain welled in her eyes as she kicked out at Mrs. Hernshaw. Flipping over, Misty fought like a wildcat, kicking backward as hard as she could onto Mrs. Hernshaw's long dead wrist. The yellow bone cracked as Mrs. Hernshaw stumbled backward. Seeing her opportunity and ignoring the pain she felt, Misty leapt to her feet and ran forward, unable to make it down the stairs to help Tabitha as she took the only other escape route available to her. Misty jumped into the hole in the stairs that her brother fell through and prayed for a soft landing. It was a short fall, broken only because she fell on top of someone. All the air in her body exploded out of her and she went down, gasping into the dark, rancid water. Dazed, she pulled herself up and stood. The water came up to her chest and smelled awful. There wasn't any light, and Misty's heart pounded wildly. She was in the dark and in the water, unable to see 2 feet in front of her. If Mrs. Hernshaw wanted to get her, now was a perfect time. Standing in the basement and soaked through by the rancid water, she walked forward, cradling her arm. She hurt her elbow in the fall, and she was pretty sure it was bad. She tried her best not to think about just how much everything hurt. Because it did, her whole body seemed to scream out in pain all at once. And there was absolutely nothing that she could do about it, until she got out of here. If she got out of here. There was a splash off to her left. She turned towards the sound. Her heart beat faster as she realized that something could come towards her through the water and she'd never even know it until it was too late. Suddenly, a light flicked on, momentarily blinding her. "Misty?" Chris asked as he splashed towards her. She rushed towards him and ignoring the pain as she wrapped her arms around him. "Chris." She sobbed into his shoulder. "I want to get out of here." He held her like that for a moment, both of them overjoyed at the fact that they were no longer alone in the dark and that neither one of them had suddenly become an only child. "How do we get out of here?" Misty asked him as she broke away. "Bad news," he told her, flashing the light over towards the stairs and showing the wreckage that remained of the staircase. "If we pull the trunk up, we should be able to climb up there," he told her. "Should?" she asked, feeling her last bit of hope drain away. "It's the only thing I can think of," Chris told her and grabbed one side of the chest. After a long pause, Misty moved and grabbed the other side. Together, they dragged it through the water and over to the broken stairwell. It was heavier now than she remembered it being the first to go around. The damn thing probably wasn't airtight and was now acting as a wooden bucket, she thought with a sigh. If the picture they needed was in there, she hoped it wasn't ruined. But the way their luck had been going, she wasn't going to hold her breath. "Crap, this is heavy." Chris groaned as they finally got it in place. Misty agreed, though she was less worried about how heavy the chest was and more worried about the fact that they couldn't hear anything upstairs. Down in the basement, it felt like being in an echo chamber. She'd hoped to hear Tabitha walk around or hell even hear Mrs. Earnshaw creeping along on the stairwell, but only silence met them. For the first time, she wondered if the other girl was dead. It could happen, she knew that much. If you hit your head just right, that could do you in as easily as anything else. Honestly, she couldn't help but wonder if Tabitha wasn't the lucky one having it happen suddenly like that. Maybe that was the best way to go. That way, you wouldn't even know you were gone. As they got the chest in place, Chris looked at her. "Did you hear anything when you came through the hole?" he asked. "Like what? Anyone else?" he asked her, looking away. "You mean like someone else down here with you?" she asked him, the hair on her arms rising as she looked around the dark, dank basement. "Yeah, did you hear anything?" he asked again. She shook her head. "No, the only person I heard down here was you when you flashed the light on me." "Why?" "No reason, just forget that I asked," he told her and then climbed on top of the crate. "I'll boost you up and then you open the door and pull me up, okay?" he asked her, changing the subject. "Sure, if you think that will work," she replied uncertainly and moved towards him. They almost fell over as he quickly boosted her up high enough so that she could grab the ledge. Misty once again ignoring the pain in her body and hands as she pulled herself onto the rotten, decrepit boards that made up the ledge. Carefully standing up, she was just about to open the basement door when the handle turned and it swung open. In shock at the suddenness of it, Misty almost fell backward off the ledge, but a familiar hand pulled her back towards the doorway before she could fall back in the water. She held onto Tabitha for a moment in shock, and was glad that the other girl was okay. Pushing her gently away, Tabitha laid down on the ledge and reached down to Chris. Misty joined her. She reached down and together they grabbed onto Chris and pulled him up onto the ledge. His eyes went wide, and from behind him they could just make out the hateful leer of Mrs. Earnshaw right before Chris was pulled back into the darkness of the basement with a loud splash. "No!" Misty screamed as his flashlight went out. If Tabitha hadn't been there to stop her, she would have gone over the ledge after him. 17. Misty couldn't believe it as she felt her brother's hand slip through hers. She was too stunned to even hear the splash as he was pulled underwater. The look on his face, one of absolute horror, was now forever burned into her mind as he disappeared under the dark water. Tabitha stood with her flashlight shining from the doorway into the flooded basement below, but Chris never resurfaced, and neither did Mrs. Earnshaw. When Misty moved as though she meant to jump off the ledge and into the water, Tabitha had grabbed her at the last minute and hauled her back. "He's gone," Tabitha told her rather coldly. "No, he can't be," Misty all but shrieked, looking down into the still waters of the basement. "I'm sorry," Tabitha said, pulling her back away from the basement. She pulled her back into the hallway of the house, away from the basement door. As far as they could get from the basement while still being in the house. "Come on, we need to get out of here," she said. "What?" Misty asked. "We need to leave, get out of here as fast as we can and never look back." "You can't be serious," Misty cried. "We can't just leave my brothers down there. We need to get the chest. It's got the picture in it." "We don't know that." She wasn't even afraid of it. You'd think if the one thing that could send her back to wherever she crawled out of was in that chest, she'd at least flinched at the sight of it. "Misty, maybe Chris and Travis were right, maybe my brother was wrong. All I know is we don't have to throw our lives away to find out," Tabitha told her quietly. Misty leaned heavily against the wall behind her. "We've got to go back for it. For all we know, it might be the only way to stop her. Maybe she needs to see it before it works. We've come too far. Lost way too much to just turn back now." Tabitha looked away from her and at the now open front door. The gaping doorway leading out into the swampy night seemed to beckon. God knows she wanted to give in and leave. There would be nothing better than going home and putting this entire night behind her for good. Then she'd leave for the old boarding school where she could pretend that Mrs. Earnshaw and the town of Beacon Hills didn't exist. Instead, she looked over at Misty and, even in the flashlight's glow, knew that they weren't turning back. She was right. They'd lost too much to turn back now. The only thing they could do was see it through to the end. No matter what that meant. She gulped inside. Fine. I can dangle you off the ledge and you can open the damn thing. What? Misty asked, shocked. What do you mean, what? How else do you think we can get it out? We can't lift the chest. It's too heavy and the stairs are gone. And if we both go in after it, we'll never be able to get back out. This is the only way. Misty bit her bottom lip and thought for a moment the house was completely silent. Fine, she said after a moment. You're right. It's the only way this is going to work. She added dryly. Don't sound too happy about it. Tabitha shot back. You don't have to do this. I'm still okay with leaving and never coming back. No, we finish this tonight, Misty told her, turning around and walking back to the basement. The basement was exactly how it had been when they left, but now it felt even more sinister than before. Misty was certain that somewhere in the depths of the basement, Mrs. Hernshaw was there waiting for them, so she could take them down with her the same way that she'd taken Chris. Just thinking about her brother was almost for Misty to start crying again, but she was able to push it back down. She'd fall apart later when she was safely at home. That's when she'd mourn for her brother, but not now. Not while they were still in danger. Carefully, Misty crawled over the ledge of the stairs and hung down, wincing as all the blood rushed to her head. Tabitha grabbed her legs. She held tightly, doing her best to stop sliding off as Misty hung completely upside down, suspended in the air. Just a little more. She yelled up. With a grunt of effort, Tabitha could let her slide down a little further. A chill of fear ran through Misty as her hands went down into the water. She expected any moment to feel the cold, dead hands of Mrs. Hernshaw latch onto her and pull her down. But it never came, and the fear slowly passed. She reached further down, feeling the edge of the chest, and pulled. Misty, hurry. Tabitha yelled from the top of the ledge as she felt herself slowly slide. Okay. Misty wheezed out. The blood rushing to her head was making her disoriented. One more hard pull, and the old rusty latch finally gave, the lid popping up as even more water rushing into the now open chest. She dug around in it the best she could, but it seemed to be nothing more than old clothes and books. After a moment of digging, her fingers brushed over what she was sure was canvas. It had to be the painting. Misty grabbed it. Pull me up. Okay. Tabitha replied and pulled her back up. Misty thought she was going to black out. Her forehead was pounding as she was pulled to the top of the ledge. There, I got you, Tabitha said, her fingers digging uncomfortably into Misty's legs as she was dragged back over the ledge. Tabitha let out a sudden whoomph sound, and the next thing Misty knew, she was falling. Air rushed by her face until suddenly she crashed down onto the side of her chest, jarring her right shoulder so bad she cried out before rolling back into the dark water. What? She moaned as she stood up, once again soaked through. She heard Tabitha rise on the other side of the chest, but before she could say anything, the basement door slammed shut up above them, and they heard the unmistakable sound of someone else jumping down into the water. Dash 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 dash. 18. What happened? Misty asked as she stood up in the waist-deep water. Tabitha moved closer to her and she wove her hand into Misty's. That old bitch pushed me, she exclaimed, her voice reverberating off the basement walls. Shush. Misty hissed. I think she's down here with us, I think I heard. She trailed off, remembering the other splash she'd heard just before they'd both fallen over the side, but before she could finish that train of thought, she felt something swim past her on her right. The wet cloth slid across her leg, making her jump. She's down here. Misty screamed and splashed closer to Tabitha, pulling herself to the other girl so they standing back to back in the water. Behind her, it sounded like someone had risen from the water and was walking towards them. Though they couldn't see her, they could feel the soft ripples she was creating as they cascaded throughout the basement. Wherever she was, Mrs. Hernshaw was getting closer. Tabitha put her back up against Misty's. In her mind, they were stronger together. We can't panic. That's what she wants us to do. We need to be strong. I think I have the painting, Misty told her, though she was far from confident that the rolled piece of canvas she had clutched in her other hand would somehow stop the horror that was slowly coming towards them. Carefully kneeling, Tabitha fished around in the water and after a moment found her flashlight. She turned it on, illuminating the basement in front of them. And for a moment both girls wished she hadn't, because the first thing they saw was the leering skeletal face of Mrs. Hernshaw staring right at them. The horrific creature seemed to smile at them as she once again headed in their direction. Her steps were deliberately slow as she waded through the water. She was toying with them and they knew it. Now, Misty, Tabitha shouted. Misty stepped forward and pulled open the canvas, holding it in front of her like a shield against the evil of Mrs. Hernshaw. The corpse-like being stopped and cocked her head to one side as she regarded what Misty held. I don't think it's working, Tabitha said slowly, her voice breaking a little at the end as she watched in horror that Mrs. Hernshaw had restarted her slow walk in their direction. Shit, Misty muttered and took a step back. Doing the only thing she could think of, she threw it at Mrs. Hernshaw, who hissed as the canvas draped over her. As the canvas touched her, Mrs. Hernshaw shrieked. It was a high-pitched guttural sound that no human throat could make. The demonic noises echoed all around them and then, as they watched, hands pulled Mrs. Hernshaw down into the water. Children's hands. Misty realized, terrified, watching as Mrs. Hernshaw struggled against them. Standing together in the water, they watched as Mrs. Hernshaw disappeared. For that, they hoped, was the last time. When it was over, Misty didn't waste any time, and moving as fast as she could, she used the chest and jumped arms out to catch the ledge. Moving faster than she ever had in her entire life, Misty scrambled up the ledge and then turned around as Tabitha ran forward and grabbed her arms. Heaving with every ounce of strength she had left, Misty pulled the other girl up onto the ledge. Is she really gone? Tabitha asked her, the words coming out between her wheezing breaths. Misty shook her head. I don't know, but I think they pulled her somewhere else, she said, suppressing a shiver at the thought of the children's hands pulling down the old ghost. Let's get out of here, Tabitha finally said, looking at the still open front door. She didn't give Misty time to talk about it or think about it. Misty wouldn't have argued, though. Her brother was gone, and now so was Mrs. Hernshaw. As far as she was concerned, it was over. Wait, Misty hollered as they made it outside the humid night air, punching them like a physical force. It had been cold inside the house, unnaturally so, but she'd forgotten that until just now. And the weight of the night air was downright oppressive. What? Tabitha asked her as Misty took off towards the shed on the property. The same one she'd been hiding in earlier that night. Tabitha realized what she was doing when the other girl soon reappeared with the old gasoline canister in her hand and walked confidently back towards the house. Before Tabitha could stop her, Misty doused the old wooden boards that made up the exterior of the house with fuel inside the canister. Whether it was kerosene or gasoline, Tabitha couldn't tell, and she wasn't going to get closer to the house to find out either. Not if she could help it. Misty kept going, dumping it in the broken windows and doorway before making a small trail backward a few feet away. As Tabitha ran over to her, Misty dug a lighter out of her pocket. It was an old Bic lighter with a cartoon wolf on it. Misty looked at Tabitha, her eyes red from crying, shock, and adrenaline. Chris got this for me when we were younger. He stole it from the gas station at the corner of Louisetta Road. She told Tabitha without looking at her, then she coached down and sparked up a small flame. For a second Tabitha thought nothing would happen, but suddenly there was a loud whooshing sound as the fuel ignited and like a fiery spear shot towards the house. Holy! Before Tabitha could finish, that thought flames hit the front door and ignited fuel and old wood. They soon had to stand back as the wood quickly caught, and the old house turned into a blazing inferno, the heat of which was immense. Take that, Misty said, barely audible. What? Tabitha asked her. She took away everything that I loved. Now I'm returning the favor. Tabitha nodded, understanding exactly how Misty felt. The glass that was still in the windows upstairs shattered outwards as a wail rose from the depths of the house. It was so loud that both girls had to cover their ears. It came again and again. An unearthly screech of untold agony. Misty and Tabitha clutched their ears. To try to stop the hideous racket, watched mesmerized as the roof sagged when the fire reached it, until it caved in on itself, crumbling the second floor and falling into the first. Parts of the first floor must have given to because they heard a loud hissing where burning timber must have crashed into the flooded basement, but it continued to burn. Even that water wasn't enough to stop the blaze. When the roof fell, the wailing stopped completely. "Is it over?" Misty asked, her eyes wide, not daring to finish it just in case it proved to be untrue. Tabitha looked at her and shrugged. "Do you really want to stick around and find out?" she asked. To which the other girl could shake her head. This time they didn't run back through the trails. They simply walked, both of them too tired to run anyway, and confident that the worst was behind them. Neither spoke as they veered around the pond in the middle of the swamp and picked the path that would carry them to the road. The swamp, once silent, had returned to life, the evil now gone. Crickets chirped and bullfrogs sang out. Somewhere in the distance, something even howled. Misty took comfort in the surrounding sounds. She took it as a sign that everything would go back to normal. Normal as it could be. It seemed like the way back took a lot less time than getting there. In fact, they barely said a word to each other until they were safely back on their street, standing in front of their own driveways. "You could stay at my house tonight," Tabitha told her. Misty looked down at her feet. "No, I've got to go home. It's the only way I'm going to be able to bring myself to tell my parents about Chris." "What are you going to say?" "Definitely not the truth," Misty said, fighting back tears. "I'm going to tell them the only thing that would make sense. He snuck out with Travis. They'll probably say he was on drugs or something. I don't care what they say. You know they'd never believe what really happened." Tabitha snorted. "Suit yourself, but the nut house has great applesauce." "I'll take your word for it. Call me tomorrow. I'm going to need a friend." "I'll do that. Just don't get mad when I pass out on your couch." "There's no way in hell I'm getting any sleep tonight," Tabitha told her, and started walking up to her driveway to her house. Misty watched her for a minute before doing the same. Soon she realized she was standing outside of her house. Not thinking, she almost turned to say something to Chris about having to take their shoes off. But realized that he wasn't there and never would be again. Refusing to cry in the front yard, she quickly took her shoes off in the shed and dropped her backpack there as well. Then Misty headed inside, although this time she didn't feel the same sense of relief. Instead, she felt profoundly empty and didn't know what to do. The entire house was dark. This time she didn't turn on any lights. Upstairs she could hear her father's heavy snoring. Marching solemnly into the house, Misty stopped only long enough to put her clothes in the wash. Then she went to her room. Nothing would ever be normal again. She realized no one would believe the truth, and only she and Tabitha would truly know what happened to her brother. In her room, she put off going to bed to shower, getting the swamp and other murk off of her. It was quick and precise, after which she flopped onto her bed and cried herself to sleep. The next morning, she told her parents. Not that Chris was dead, she couldn't do that. Not without accidentally telling the truth about what happened. She knew that if she got started down that route, she wouldn't be able to stop herself before it all poured out. Misty kept it simple and told her that her parents that Chris had snuck out with Travis and that he wasn't in his room this morning. At first they were angry, but then the cops came. The same kind-eyed deputy who'd asked them about Mike now asked them about Travis, who had been found drowned in a kiddie pool in his neighbor's yard, after he torched the Robertsons' old doghouse with a Molotov cocktail. That's when her parents' anger changed to worry. And they asked her more questions. She played dumb and let them fill in the gaps. Even though it killed her to do so. It killed her to lie to them. Misty didn't have to fake it when the tears came. She'd suspected that something had happened to Travis, but hearing it out loud was too much. They'd lost everybody, even though in the end they'd stopped Mrs. Hernshaw. It didn't feel like a victory. Tabitha came over while her parents were down at the station. They talked little though, just watched television and tried to pretend that the world was normal again. Before it got too dark, she left. Her parents came home a little later, grim-faced. Her mother went straight to her bedroom after informing Misty that they'd be organizing a search of the swamp the next day. Her father, on the other hand, went straight into the kitchen and pulled his bottle out from under the sink. This time he didn't use a glass. Misty didn't blame him. She doubted they'd ever find Chris. She wondered which would be worse for them, but didn't know either way. The fact that her brother was gone stayed the same. Tired and dejected, Misty tried to sleep, but it wouldn't come, so she decided to relax the only way she knew how, with a hot bath. Baths had always helped her relax and clear her mind in the past. Picking from her collection of salts, balms, and other mixtures, she chose the best and watched in delight as the steam rose from her tub. Letting it cool for just a second, she slowly eased herself in, sighing in relief as she crawled into the warm water. The salts fizzled and tickled her bare skin as she sank down to her chin, making sure as much as her body was submerged as possible. Misty took a long deep breath, inhaling the scents of the tub, and just like that she knew she wasn't alone. Because above all those other scents, one stood out. The swamp. The whole bathroom stank of it. She opened her eyes and tried to scream. There on the other side of the tub was Chris, but he was pale and his skin flesh looked bloated. "Hey sis," he told her, smiling. She cringed as the black swamp water poured through his teeth. "What?" Misty gasped. "It's not that bad. She's gone now thanks to you, but it's lonely. We miss you," he said. His voice sounded like it was coming up from under the water. "No, this isn't real," Misty said. "Go away." She moved to get out of the tub, when two more figures stepped out of the shadows of the bathroom and pushed her under the water. Misty struggled, and opened her eyes to see the faces of Travis and Mike. She gasped and screamed under the bathwater, which only made it fill her lungs faster. Her brother and her friends smiled at her with dead eyes as she slowly stopped struggling, and the bathwater was once again still. Epilogue. Tabitha attended the funeral. It seemed like the right thing to do, even though it brought back a lot of terrible memories. She couldn't believe that Misty was gone. They'd made it out alive and stopped Mrs. Hernshaw once and for all. None of it made sense. She felt terrible for Misty's parents. They just lost 2 children in the same week. Not that she knew what to say to them. Her mother and father didn't even come, apparently deciding that they'd seen enough children's funerals for a lifetime. Or perhaps it just brought up too many bad memories for them as well. The paper speculated that it was a suicide. Most people figured Misty blamed herself for her brother's disappearance. Tabitha didn't know what to think. Part of her wished that she'd made more of an effort to watch Misty, but she'd never in a million years have expected something like this to happen. At first, she'd even considered that perhaps Mrs. Hernshaw was back. Tabitha had expected to be next in the following days, but it hadn't happened. No sign that the evil spirit was hunting her. That's when she started wondering if the papers had been right after all. Misty hadn't just lost her brother, she'd lost all her friends as well. Tabitha knew how hard it was to go through that. She just never would have thought Misty would call it quits. Either way, she watched as they lowered 2 coffins down into side-by-side graves. One containing the first real friend she'd made in years and the other empty, because the search teams hadn't been able to locate the body. And she strongly suspected that they never would. Afterward, she didn't stick around long, and her parents didn't fight her when she asked to go back to school early. Not that it was much better there, but it was far away from the reminders of Beacon Hills. And far away from the questioning looks she got from people who wondered just how much she actually knew. Many of them probably thought she'd gotten the kids hooked on designer drugs from her private school friends. Honestly, she didn't care what they thought because she was never coming back. The school was the same. She had a couple of superficial friends there, and when asked about her summer, Tabitha gave the same vague replies she always did. Beach stuff. Being her go-to. They didn't pry because deep down they didn't care, and that was fine with her. At least this semester her class load wasn't terrible, though it disappointed her to learn that for PE, they'd be making use of the pools. Not only did she hate swimming laps, Tabitha really didn't want to get in the water again anytime soon. She decided she would try to get a note from her parents. They'd do it, she was sure of that. She just hoped it would work. As she left the pool area to head to her next class, she noticed someone who looked a lot like Misty staring at her from in the water. But when she turned, the other girl was gone. Tabitha stared at the pool for a moment and caught a whiff of the swamp. Then she turned and left as fast as she could. She'd have to talk to her doctor about the meds she was on as well. Her dosage was too high if she was seeing things. As she headed upstairs to shower before calling her parents, she couldn't shake the smell of the swamp and the feeling that she wasn't alone, but Tabitha chalked it up to the meds and pushed it out of her mind. After all, they'd stopped the ghost of Mrs. Hernshaw. It was over, right? About the author. Jacob Peyton is an introverted shut-in trapped in a cave surrounded by books, somewhere in rural Virginia. When he's not reading or writing, Jacob is probably either wandering the Mojave Wasteland in Fallout New Vegas, or is somewhere in Tamriel on ESO. Or watching the 1980 Flash Gordon and laughing manically around 24 minutes in when Sam Jones gets the beat down by a bunch of guys in tights. Sorry Sam, but seriously, if you haven't seen that, do yourself a favor and check it out. On the rare occasions that Jacob is pried from his cave, he enjoys hiking, traveling and climbing around bookstores after old pulp paperbacks. If you wish to hurry him along in writing the next book, compliment or yell at him, feel free to shoot a message at authorjacobpeyton@gmail.com. Please no spam. You can also follow him at Twitter at JakeLaPeyton, or on Facebook www.facebook.com/authorjacobpeyton. But don't forget to mosey on over to www.jacobpeyton.com and make sure to sign up for his newsletter, which is chock full of cool stuff. Also, if you found yourself enjoying this book, even if only a little, please take the time to leave a review anywhere you like. But if you need suggestions, Goodreads is always a good place to start. Because even shut-ins need to keep their caves properly provisioned. And if you want to read new updates, short stories, and more, check out my Patreon over at https://www.patreon.com/JacobPeyton.